Hey everyone, welcome to East Park. I hope you're all doing well. Today I want to argue that South Park, a show that has been on the air for nearly 3 decades and has produced over 300 episodes, has only 5 episodes that are permanently banned from every streaming platform on Earth. Story behind those bans is not really about a cartoon going too far. It is about what happens when free speech collides with real power. Whether that power comes from death threats by extremist groups, corporate pressure from Hollywood's biggest stars, organized campaigns by religious institutions, or the push of a button by the government of the most populous nation on the planet. The result is always the same. Content disappears, voices get silenced, and the rest of us lose the ability to decide for ourselves what we should and should not be allowed to watch. Over the next few hours, we are going to walk through every single one of these banned and censored episodes, the real-world events that caused them to be erased, and what all of it reveals about who actually controls what you see on your screen. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. The show that was never supposed to survive. Before we even talk about the episodes that got banned, pulled from the internet, and erased from streaming platforms, we need to understand something important about South Park itself. Because the truth is, this show was never supposed to make it this far. It was never supposed to last 3 decades. It was never supposed to win Emmy Awards or a Peabody Award. And it was definitely never supposed to become one of the most important case studies in free speech and censorship in modern entertainment history. But here we are. South Park started in the most unlikely way possible. Before it was ever a television show, before it was ever on Comedy Central, before any of the controversy or the bans or the death threats, South Park was a short animated video that 2 college students made as a Christmas card. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, 2 guys from Colorado, created a crude little animated short that showed Jesus Christ and Santa Claus getting into a brutal, bloody fist fight. That was the joke. That was the whole thing. 2 of the most beloved figures in Western culture beating each other senseless in the snow, and people loved it. The video got passed around Hollywood in the mid-1990s, back when passing something around meant physically handing someone a VHS tape. Executives saw it, laughed, and eventually gave Parker and Stone a shot at making a real show. Now you have to remember, this was 1997. The internet was barely a thing. Social media did not exist. YouTube would not be invented for another 8 years. The idea of an animated show for adults was still pretty new. The Simpsons had been around since 1989, and Beavis and Butthead had made some noise on MTV, but the concept of a cartoon that was specifically designed to offend people, to push every single boundary it could find, was still pretty radical. And from the very first episode, Parker and Stone made it absolutely clear what kind of show this was going to be. The pilot episode of South Park, the very first thing audiences ever saw, centered around one of the 4 main child characters being abducted by aliens and having a probe inserted into his body. That was episode 1. That was the introduction. That was Parker and Stone walking up to the line of good taste, looking at it, and then sprinting as far past it as they possibly could. And that energy never stopped. Season after season, year after year, South Park went after everyone and everything. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Scientology, Mormonism, Buddhism, Democrats and Republicans, celebrities, politicians, activists, corporations. If you existed in public life, South Park was coming for you. The show made fun of Tom Cruise, Kanye West, Al Gore, George Bush, Paris Hilton, Barbara Streisand, Mel Gibson, and dozens of others. It depicted world leaders as idiots, religious figures as flawed, and sacred institutions as ridiculous. And for the most part, all of this was completely fine. People complained, sure, letters got written, religious groups put out statements, but the show kept going. Nobody got banned. Nobody got pulled off the air. This is the part that most people do not realize. South Park has been on television for nearly 30 years now. It has produced well over 300 episodes across more than 27 seasons. It has made fun of almost every single group of people you can think of. And out of all of those episodes, all of those years, all of those controversies, only 5 episodes have been permanently banned from streaming. 5 out of more than 300. That is less than 2% of the entire show. When you hear people talk about South Park being banned or illegal, they are really talking about a very small number of episodes that crossed a very specific line. And understanding what that line line is and why those particular episodes crossed it while hundreds of others did not is really what this whole video is about. Because here is the thing about South Park that makes it different from almost every other show on television. Most shows that get in trouble for offensive content are shows that accidentally went too far. They made a joke they did not think through, or they included something that aged badly, or they misjudged their audience. South Park is not like that. South Park goes too far on purpose every single time. Parker and Stone have built their entire career on the idea that either everything is okay to joke about or nothing is. There is no middle ground. There is no list of protected topics. If they are going to make fun of Christianity, they are also going to make fun of Islam. If they are going to mock Democrats, they are also going to mock Republicans. If they are going to go after small targets, they are also going to go after the biggest, most powerful, most dangerous targets they can find. And for a long time, that approach worked perfectly. The show got complaints, but complaints are just words. The Catholic League would put out a press release. A politician would say something negative on the news. A parent group would organize a boycott. But none of that ever actually stopped the show from airing. None of that ever got episodes permanently removed. The complaints were just part of the game. Parker and Stone expected them. They welcomed them. In many ways, the complaints were proof that the show was doing its job. If nobody was upset, the episode probably was not sharp enough. But then something changed. Not with the show itself, but with the world around it. Because there is a massive difference between someone writing an angry letter and someone threatening to kill you. There is a massive difference between a religious group calling for a boycott and a government erasing your entire show from the internet of a country with over 1 billion people. There is a massive difference between controversy and danger. And at some point in South Park's history, the show stopped just being controversial and started being genuinely dangerous to the people who made it. That shift did not happen overnight. It happened in stages over several years as a series of events around the world changed the rules of what you could and could not put on television. And to understand those events, you have to look at what was happening not just in the United States, but in Europe, the Middle East, and eventually Asia. Because the story of South Park's banned episodes is not really a story about a cartoon. It is a story about power, who has it, how they use it, and what happens when a couple of guys from Colorado with construction paper cutouts decide to challenge it. What makes this whole thing even more interesting is that Parker and Stone did not back down when things got serious. When most people received death threats, they stopped doing the thing that caused the death threats. That is a completely reasonable, completely understandable reaction, but Parker and Stone are not most people. When they were told they could not show something, their immediate response was to try even harder to show it. When they were told a topic was off limits, they made it the centerpiece of their next episode. When they were told that pushing further could have real physical consequences for them and the people who worked at their network, they pushed further anyway. You can call that brave. You can call that reckless. You can call that stupid. But whatever you call it, you cannot call it cowardly. And in a media landscape where almost every major company and every major creator is willing to censor themselves to avoid upsetting the wrong people, that stubbornness is what makes the South Park story worth telling. Now, I want to be clear about something before we go any further. This video is not going to argue that everything South Park has ever done is good or right or justified. Some of their episodes have genuinely hurt people. Some of their jokes have aged terribly. Some of their targets probably did not deserve the level of ridicule they received. That is all true, but none of that is what we are here to talk about. We are here to talk about the episodes that were banned. The episodes that were erased, the episodes that became, in a very real sense, illegal to watch through any official channel, and the reasons behind those bans tell us something much bigger than whether or not a particular joke was funny. They tell us about what power looks like in the 21st century. They tell us about where the actual limits of free speech are, not the theoretical limits we learn about in school, but the real practical limits that exist when someone with enough power decides they do not want something to exist anymore. And they tell us about what happens when the people making art refuse to accept those limits, even when accepting them would be the smart, safe, easy thing to do. So let us start at the beginning. Not with the most famous banned episode, and not with the most controversial one, but with the one that might be the strangest ban in the history of television. An episode that aired in the summer of 2001 with absolutely no problems, no controversy, and no pushback whatsoever. An episode where Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, appeared on screen completely uncensored, used superpowers, helped save the day, and nobody cared. Nobody protested, nobody threatened anyone. It just aired and life moved on. And then, nearly a decade later, that same episode was pulled from every platform, erased from the official website, and made impossible to watch through any legal means. Not because of anything the episode did, but because the world around it had changed so dramatically that something that was totally fine in 2001 had become too dangerous to exist by 2010. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That episode is called Super Best Friends, and its story is where this whole thing really begins. Section 2, Super Best Friends, the episode that was fine until it wasn't on July 4th, 2001. While most Americans were eating hot dogs and watching fireworks, Comedy Central aired an episode of South Park called Super Best Friends. It was the third episode of the show's 5th season, written and directed by Trey Parker, and at the time, it was just another episode. Nobody treated it as special, nobody treated it as dangerous, nobody treated it as the kind of thing that would one day need to be erased from the internet. It was just South Park being South Park, doing what it always did, which was taking something from the real world and turning it into something completely absurd. The plot of Super Best Friends was pretty straightforward by South Park standards. A magician named David Blaine comes to the town of South Park and starts performing street magic. The boys, like everyone else in town, are amazed by his tricks, but Blaine is not just doing card tricks and making things disappear. He is actually recruiting people into a cult. The episode called it Blaintology, which was a clear joke about real-world cults and how charismatic leaders can convince ordinary people to follow them blindly. Kyle, Stan, Cartman, and Kenny all get sucked in at first, but Stan starts to realize something is wrong. The Blaintologists are not as friendly as they seem, and the whole thing starts feeling less like a magic show and more like a trap. Now here is where the episode gets into the territory that would eventually cause all the problems. Stan, desperate to save his friends from the cult, asks Jesus for help. Not metaphorical Jesus, not a spiritual presence. Actual physical cartoon Jesus, who in the world of South Park is just a regular guy living in town who happens to be the Son of God. Jesus agrees to help, but he quickly realizes that he cannot take on David Blaine alone. Blaine is too powerful and his cult is growing too fast, so Jesus makes a call to his team, his superhero team. This is where the Super Best Friends come in. The episode introduced a group that was a direct parody of the old DC Comics cartoon called Super Friends. But instead of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, this team was made up of religious figures from the world's major faiths. The lineup included Jesus Christ, Buddha, Moses, Krishna, Joseph Smith, a sea-based superhero named Seaman, who was a parody of Aquaman, and the Prophet Muhammad. Every single one of these figures was depicted as a cartoon character with special powers. Jesus could do carpentry at super speed. Buddha had special fighting abilities. Moses appeared as a giant floating head that looked like the Master Control program from the movie Tron. Krishna could shapeshift, and Muhammad had the power of fire. He could shoot flames and use them to fight enemies. And that last part is what matters for our story. Muhammad appeared on screen, fully visible, completely uncensored. He wore yellow robes, an orange turban, had thick eyebrows and dark facial hair. He spoke lines of dialogue. He used his fire powers to help defeat David Blaine's giant stone Abraham Lincoln. He was, in every way, treated exactly the same as every other religious figure in the episode. Jesus was there cracking jokes, Buddha was there being part of the team, and Muhammad was there too, right alongside them saving the day, and nobody cared. That is the part of this story that you really need to sit with for a moment, because it is the key to understanding everything that comes later. When Super Best Friends aired on July 4th, 2001, the depiction of Muhammad generated almost zero controversy. There were no protests, there were no angry press releases from religious organizations, there were no threats against the show or its creators, there were no calls to pull the episode from the air. It just aired, people watched it, and everyone moved on with their lives. The episode was included on the Season 5 DVD set without any changes. It was available on the South Park Studios website for years. It was on Netflix. It was on every platform that carried the show. Nobody treated Muhammad's appearance as anything different from the appearance of Jesus or Buddha or any of the other religious figures in the episode. In fact, if you look at what people actually talked about when the episode aired, the conversation was mostly about David Blaine. The whole Blaintology storyline was a thinly veiled parody of Scientology, and Parker even confirmed this on the DVD commentary. The jokes about cult recruitment, mass suicide, and blind devotion to a charismatic leader were clearly aimed at real-world organizations that operate in similar ways. But at the time, even that did not generate the kind of backlash you might expect. The episode aired, it got decent reviews, and South Park kept rolling on to the next week. Now, here is something else that most people do not know. Muhammad did not just appear in Super Best Friends, he also appeared completely uncensored in the opening title sequence of the show itself. Starting in season 6, the opening credits featured a big crowd shot of all the characters in South Park standing together, and if you looked carefully, Muhammad was right there in the crowd, standing among all the other characters, fully visible, completely uncensored. This continued for multiple seasons, season 6, season 10, season 11. Muhammad was just standing there in the opening of every single episode, and nobody noticed or nobody cared. He was also visible on a lunchbox that Stan carried in the episode Baby's Boobs Destroy Society, just casually there in the background like any other character. So what changed? Why did an episode that nobody had a problem with in 2001 become so dangerous that it had to be permanently removed from every platform almost a decade later? The short answer is that the world changed. The long answer is much more complicated, and it involves events that happened thousands of miles from Colorado, in a country that most South Park fans had probably never thought about in connection with a cartoon show. But before we get to those events, we need to understand the timeline. Super Best Friends aired on July 4th, 2001. That date is important. It was exactly 2 months and 7 days before September 11th. The September 11th attacks did not have anything directly to do with South Park or with depictions of Muhammad in cartoons, but they changed the entire cultural atmosphere around Islam, the Middle East, and religious sensitivity in the West. Suddenly, conversations about Islam were not just academic or theoretical, they were tied to real violence, real fear, and real tension between communities. The temperature around anything involving Islam in Western media went up dramatically, and it stayed up. Even so, South Park kept going. For the next several years after September 11th, the show continued to push boundaries on every topic imaginable. They made fun of the war on terror, they mocked Osama bin Laden, they satirized the invasion of Iraq, they went after the government, the media, the public, and everyone in between. And for a while, even after the cultural shift following September 11th, nobody went back and complained about Super Best Friends. The episode sat there on streaming platforms and DVD shelves, gathering dust, with Muhammad right there on screen for anyone to see. It was not until 2005 that the first real tremor hit, and it did not come from America at all. It came from Denmark, from a newspaper called Jyllands-Posten, and from 12 editorial cartoons that would set off a chain of events leading to riots, death, and eventually the permanent banning of 5 South Park episodes. But we will get to that in a moment. What happened to Super Best Friends specifically is that it got caught in the blast radius of something that happened years after it aired. In 2006, after the Danish cartoon controversy had already exploded, Comedy Central started getting nervous about anything involving Muhammad on their network. And when the Cartoon Wars episodes in season 10 tried to show Muhammad on screen, Comedy Central refused to allow it and censored the image with a black title card. Parker and Stone were frustrated. They pointed out correctly that Muhammad had already been shown on their show 5 years earlier without any censorship at all. Nobody had complained, nobody had threatened anyone. The character had been right there on screen, fully visible, and the world had not ended. But Comedy Central did not care about what had happened in 2001. They cared about what was happening in 2006. And in 2006, showing Muhammad on television felt like it could get people killed. Still, even after the Cartoon Wars controversy, Super Best Friends remained available. It was still on the website. It was still on streaming platforms. It was still on DVD. Comedy Central was nervous, but they had not yet made the decision to go back and erase something that had already been out in the world for years. That decision did not come until 2010, after episodes 200 and 201 aired and the real threat started, after a group called Revolution Muslim posted warnings on their website comparing Parker and Stone to a Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered, after the New York Police Department increased security around Comedy Central headquarters, after the entire situation stopped being about offensive cartoons and started being about the genuine physical safety of real human beings. It was at that point that Comedy Central went back through their entire catalog of South Park episodes and pulled everything that showed Muhammad. Super Best Friends was removed from the South Park Studios website. It was removed from Netflix. It was removed from Hulu. It was removed from every streaming platform that carried the show. When South Park eventually moved to HBO Max, Super Best Friends was not included. When the show moved again to Paramount Plus, it was not included there either. As of today, the episode is not legally available to stream anywhere. The only official way to watch it is on the Season 5 DVD set, which was released before the ban happened and is still in circulation. What makes the Super Best Friends ban so strange, so uniquely bizarre compared to every other banned episode, is that the episode itself did nothing wrong by anyone's standards at the time it was made. It was not designed to provoke. It was not created to test the limits of censorship. It was not Parker and Stone deliberately picking a fight. Muhammad was just one member of a superhero team treated with the same level of respect and irreverence as every other character. The episode was a David Blaine parody, not a Muhammad controversy. The fact that it became one of the most inaccessible episodes in television history has nothing to do with the content of the episode and everything to do with what happened in the world afterward. And that is what makes this case so interesting from a free speech perspective. Super Best Friends was not banned because it was offensive. It was banned because something that was not considered offensive in 2001 became considered dangerous by 2010. The episode did not change, the world changed. And when the world changed, the episode was no longer allowed to exist. Parker himself told a story about finding out that his depiction of Muhammad had become controversial. He said he was on his honeymoon at Disney World when he turned on the television and saw thousands of people rioting. The caption on screen said the protests were about cartoons depicting Muhammad. Parker thought they had finally discovered the Super Best Friends episode and were angry about it. But no, it was about different cartoons entirely, from a Danish newspaper that had published something far less elaborate than what South Park had already aired years earlier. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and those Danish cartoons, those 12 drawings in a newspaper that most Americans had never heard of, are the real reason that Super Best Friends and 4 other South Park episodes are illegal to watch today. Because what happened after those cartoons were published changed the rules of Western media forever, and South Park, whether it wanted to or not, was about to find itself right in the middle of it all. Section 3. The Danish cartoons that changed everything. To understand why 5 episodes of South Park are permanently banned from the internet, we actually need to leave South Park behind for a moment and travel to Denmark. Because the chain of events that would eventually lead to death threats against Trey Parker and Matt Stone increased police security around Comedy Central headquarters, and the permanent erasure of episodes from streaming platforms did not start in Colorado. It started in a small Scandinavian country with a newspaper that most people outside of Europe had never heard of, and a decision by one editor that would end up costing over 200 lives. In September 2005, a Danish writer named Cora Blutgen was working on a children's book about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. It was an educational book, not a political statement, not a satire, not an attack on anyone, just a book for kids. But Blutgen ran into a problem. He could not find a single illustrator who was willing to draw pictures of Muhammad for the book. Every artist he approached turned him down. They were afraid. In many traditions within Islam, creating images of Muhammad is considered deeply disrespectful or outright forbidden. And after years of growing tension around the topic, no illustrator wanted to be the person who put their name on drawings of the Prophet. They were worried about backlash. They were worried about their safety. When this story became public, it caught the attention of a man named Flemming Rose, who was the cultural editor of a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten. Rose saw the situation as a free speech issue. He felt that the fear surrounding depictions of Muhammad was a form of self-censorship, and that self-censorship in a free society was a dangerous thing, so he made a decision. He contacted 12 different cartoonists and asked each of them to draw their interpretation of Muhammad. On September 30th, 2005, Jyllands-Posten published all 12 cartoons on a single page. The cartoons varied widely. Some were fairly mild. Some were more pointed. The one that would become the most famous and the most controversial showed Muhammad wearing a turban that was shaped like a bomb with a lit fuse. It was a provocative image, clearly designed to make a statement about the connection between Islamic extremism and violence. But it was also, at the end of the day, a drawing in a newspaper in a country of about 5.5 million people. At first, almost nothing happened. The cartoons were published on September 30th, and for the next several weeks, the reaction was minimal. A few Danish Muslim organizations filed complaints. Some local protests took place. About 3,500 people demonstrated peacefully in Copenhagen, but it was all relatively contained. The cartoons were reprinted in a few other European newspapers in the Netherlands and Germany, but the story had not yet exploded beyond Scandinavia. For roughly 3 months, it seemed like the whole thing might just blow over. It did not blow over. In late 2005, a group of Danish imams, led by a man named Ahmed Akari, decided to take the issue international. They put together a collection of documents that included the 12 original Jyllands-Posten cartoons along with other images, some of which were real and some of which turned out to be fake. One of the images they included was not a cartoon of Muhammad at all. It was a photograph of a man at a pig squealing contest wearing a pig nose. The imams presented this image as if it were a cartoon depicting Muhammad as a pig, which is considered deeply offensive in Islam since pigs are viewed as unclean. When challenged about this fake image later, members of the group admitted that the goal had been to stir up controversy, and stir it up they did. The group traveled to the Middle East with their collection of documents and presented them to religious and political leaders in several Muslim-majority countries. They held meetings, they gave interviews. They made sure that people who had never heard of Jyllands-Posten or Denmark or these 12 cartoons were suddenly very aware of them, and the response was enormous. Starting in late January 2006 and continuing through February, massive protests erupted across the Muslim world. These were not small, contained demonstrations like the one in Copenhagen. These were huge, sometimes violent events involving tens of thousands of people in multiple countries. Danish embassies were attacked. In Damascus, Syria, the building housing the Danish embassy was stormed and set on fire. In Beirut, Lebanon, thousands of protesters took to the streets and the Danish consulate was burned. In Afghanistan, rioters attacked the Bagram air base and at least 4 people were shot by police during the assault. There were protests in Pakistan, Iraq, Indonesia, the Palestinian territories, Nigeria, and dozens of other countries, and people died. This is the part of the story that transforms it from a debate about newspaper cartoons into something much darker. The protests and riots that followed the publication of these 12 drawings led to at least 139 confirmed deaths, with some estimates putting the number as high as 250. Embassies were destroyed. Churches were attacked, entire communities were thrown into chaos, all because of 12 drawings in a Danish newspaper. Now, it is important to be fair about something here. The vast majority of Muslims around the world did not participate in violence. The vast majority of Muslims who were offended by the cartoons expressed that offense peacefully and within their rights. The violence came from a relatively small number of people, and many Muslim leaders and organizations spoke out against it. But the violence was real, and it was deadly, and it sent a shockwave through every newsroom, every television network, and every media company in the Western world. The message was clear, even if most people did not want to say it out loud. Depicting Muhammad in Western media could now get people killed. Not hypothetically, not theoretically, actually killed. Embassies burned, people shot, real violence in real places with real consequences. And that message landed hard in the United States. Major American newspapers, almost without exception, chose not to reprint the Danish cartoons. They reported on the controversy, they discussed it, they debated it, but they did not show the actual images. This was a significant editorial decision. These were the same newspapers that had published all kinds of controversial content over the years, that had defended free speech and press freedom as core American values. But when it came to these 12 cartoons, they drew the line. The risk was simply too great. Television networks were even more cautious. The idea of showing Muhammad on screen in any context, in any form, became something that executives were genuinely afraid of. Not afraid of angry letters or boycotts or bad press, but afraid of physical violence against their employees, afraid of their buildings being attacked, afraid of their people being hurt or killed. That is a fundamentally different kind of fear than anything the entertainment industry had dealt with before, at least not on this scale, and this is where the story connects back to South Park. Because remember, South Park had already shown Muhammad on screen, fully uncensored, fully visible. Back in 2001, in Super Best Friends, Muhammad had been right there on television, using fire powers and helping to save the day. Nobody had cared at the time because the world was different in 2001. The Danish cartoons had not happened yet. The protests had not happened yet. The deaths had not happened yet. The entire cultural framework around depicting Muhammad in Western media had not yet been built, but by early 2006, that framework was firmly in place. And Trey Parker and Matt Stone, being who they are, looked at this new reality and decided they wanted to push right up against it. You have to understand their perspective. Parker and Stone had shown Muhammad in 2001 with zero consequences. Now, in 2006, they were being told by their own network that they could never show Muhammad again. The rules had changed, not because of anything they had done, but because of something a Danish newspaper had done. And the reason the rules had changed was not because showing Muhammad was morally wrong, it was because showing Muhammad was physically dangerous. The censorship was not based on principle, it was based on fear. Parker and Stone found this unacceptable. They saw it as exactly the kind of cowardice that their show existed to call out. If Comedy Central was willing to show Jesus getting mocked, if they were willing to show Buddha being satirized, if they were willing to let the show go after Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, and every other religion on the planet, then why was Islam the one religion that got special protection? Not because of respect for the faith, but because of fear of what some of its most extreme followers might do. This was not a theoretical question for Parker and Stone. It was the kind of question that made them want to create an entire episode about it, and that is exactly what they did. Within weeks of the Danish cartoon controversy reaching its peak, Parker and Stone went to Comedy Central with a plan. They wanted to make an episode that directly addressed the Muhammad censorship issue. They wanted to show Muhammad on screen, not in a disrespectful way, not in an insulting way, just standing there. Just existing as a character, the same way he had existed in Super Best Friends 5 years earlier. Their argument was simple. If we already showed him once and nothing happened, why can we not show him again? Comedy Central's answer was immediate and absolute. No, under no circumstances. It was not going to happen. The network executives were not interested in debating free speech or artistic integrity or the principle of treating all religions equally. They were interested in making sure nobody got hurt, and in a post-Danish cartoons world, showing Muhammad on an American television network felt like it could genuinely put people in danger. Parker and Stone were furious, but they did not give up. Instead, they did what they always do when someone tells them they cannot do something. They made the thing they were told they could not do into the entire point of the episode. If Comedy Central would not let them show Muhammad, then they would make an episode about the fact that Comedy Central would not let them show Muhammad. They would turn the censorship itself into the content. They would hold up a mirror to their own network and say, look at what you are doing. Look at what fear has turned you into. The result was a 2-part episode called Cartoon Wars, and it would become one of the most talked about, most debated, and most permanently banned pieces of television ever created. It was South Park's first real battle with its own network over the right to show what it wanted to show. And it was the beginning of a war that would eventually lead to death threats, police protection, and the erasure of 5 episodes from every legal platform on the planet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Cartoon Wars was not just about Muhammad and censorship. It was also about something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with religion or free speech. It was also the episode where Parker and Stone went to war with another animated show, one that they felt represented everything wrong with comedy on television, and that show was Family Guy. Section 4, Cartoon Wars. When South Park fought its own network. By the spring of 2006, Trey Parker and Matt Stone had been making South Park for nearly a decade. They had gone after presidents, religious leaders, celebrities, activists, and entire countries. They had depicted Jesus watching pornography, Moses as a floating computer program, and Saddam Hussein as the devil's boyfriend. Through all of it, Comedy Central had been their partner. The network had given them creative freedom that was almost unheard of in television. Sure, there were small battles here and there, a word that needed to be bleeped, a scene that got trimmed. But for the most part, Parker and Stone could do whatever they wanted and the network would air it. That was the deal. That was how South Park worked, until it wasn't. When Parker and Stone walked into Comedy Central's offices in early 2006 and told the executives what they wanted to do, the response was unlike anything they had experienced before. They wanted to make an episode about the Danish cartoon controversy. They wanted to address the question of why Western media had collectively decided that Muhammad was the one subject that could not be touched. And most importantly, they wanted to show Muhammad on screen, not doing anything offensive, not being mocked or ridiculed, just standing there. Just existing as a character in an episode of South Park, the same way he had existed 5 years earlier in Super Best Friends, without a single person raising a complaint. Comedy Central said no, this was not a negotiation. This was not the network saying, let's talk about it, or maybe we can find a compromise. This was a hard, absolute refusal. The executives at Comedy Central told Parker and Stone that under no circumstances would the network allow an image of Muhammad to appear on their channel. The Danish cartoon controversy was still fresh. The protests had killed people. Embassies had been burned. The network was not going to put its employees at risk over a cartoon. Parker and Stone understood the fear. They were not stupid. They knew the Danish cartoons had led to real violence and real death. But they also felt that giving in to that fear was exactly the wrong response. Their argument was straightforward. South Park makes fun of every religion. It mocks Jesus constantly. It has gone after Judaism, Christianity, Mormonism, Buddhism, Scientology, and everything in between. If the show is going to treat all religions the same way, then Islam cannot be the exception. And the reason Islam was being treated as an exception had nothing to do with respect for the faith. It had everything to do with fear of violence. Comedy Central was not saying, we respect Islam too much to satirize it. Comedy Central was essentially saying, we are afraid of getting blown up. Parker and Stone have talked about this distinction in multiple interviews over the years, and it is an important one. They understood that the network was making a safety decision, not a moral one, and they did not hold it against Comedy Central personally. But they also believe that making safety decisions based on threats of violence is exactly how you let terrorism win. If a small group of extremists can get an entire television network to change its content by threatening violence, then those extremists have effectively gained control over what millions of Americans are allowed to see. And that, to Parker and Stone, was unacceptable, so they did what they always do. They could not show Muhammad on screen, so instead they made an entire two-part episode about the fact that they could not show Muhammad on screen. The episodes were called Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Cartoon Wars Part 2, and they aired on April 5th and April 12th, 2006 as the third and fourth episodes of South Park's 10th season, and they were absolutely savage. The setup was brilliant. In the world of the show, the animated series Family Guy announces that it is planning to air an episode that will feature an image of Muhammad. When the citizens of South Park hear about this, they panic. They are terrified that the episode will air and that violent retaliation will follow, destroying their town in the process. The whole town scrambles to figure out how to stop Family Guy from showing Muhammad on television. Now here is where it gets clever. Cartman, who is usually the villain in any given episode of South Park, suddenly becomes the character trying to get the Family Guy episode pulled. But Cartman does not care about Muslims or Muhammad or religious sensitivity. Cartman just hates Family Guy. He thinks the show is terrible and he sees the Muhammad controversy as an opportunity to get it canceled. Kyle, on the other hand, argues passionately that the episode should air. Kyle believes in free speech. He believes that if you let one group's threats dictate what can and cannot be shown on television, you are setting a precedent that will destroy creative freedom for everyone. This dynamic between Cartman and Kyle was clearly a stand-in for the real debate happening behind the scenes. Parker and Stone were using their own characters to argue both sides of the issue they were personally fighting over with their network. Kyle's speeches about censorship and intimidation were Parker and Stone talking directly to Comedy Central through the mouth of a cartoon fourth grader. But Cartoon Wars was not just about the Muhammad issue. It was also a full-scale takedown of Family Guy, and this part of the episode became almost as famous as the censorship storyline. Parker and Stone have never been shy about their feelings towards Seth MacFarlane's show. They strongly dislike Family Guy's writing style. They feel that the show relies on random, disconnected jokes and pop culture references that have nothing to do with the story being told, rather than building humor organically through character and narrative. In Cartoon Wars Part 2, Kyle goes behind the scenes of the Family Guy production and discovers that the show's writers are not people at all. They are manatees. trained sea cows who select random topics from a pool of idea balls and combine them into jokes that have no connection to anything. It was one of the most pointed and memorable attacks one television show has ever made against another. The creative teams behind other animated shows noticed. After Cartoon Wars Part 1 aired, the producers of The Simpsons sent flowers to Parker and Stone. The people behind King of the Hill at Fox called to express their support, telling Parker and Stone they were doing God's work. Parker later said that there was a moment of solidarity among animated show creators who all shared a frustration with Family Guy's success. He incorporated these reactions into the show itself. In Part 2, Cartman meets Bart Simpson, and the two bond over their shared dislike of Family Guy before agreeing that Cartman is by far the more evil and manipulative of the two. But as much fun as the Family Guy stuff was, the Muhammad storyline was the heart of the episode, and the climax was devastating. In the story, Kyle gives an impassioned speech to the president of Fox about why the Family Guy episode should air, even if it means people might get hurt. The speech was essentially Parker and Stone's own argument, delivered through Kyle, aimed directly at Comedy Central. The message was clear. Yes, there might be consequences. Yes, people might be angry. But if you give in to threats of violence, you are allowing terrorism to work. You are telling the world that all you need to do to silence the American media is threaten to hurt someone. And that is a far more dangerous outcome than anything a cartoon could ever cause. In the end, within the story, the Fox network president decides to air the Family Guy episode with Muhammad in it. The terrorists respond with their own cartoon showing Jesus and George Bush defecating on each other, which the show aired uncensored. The point was impossible to miss. You can show Jesus doing the most disgusting things imaginable and nobody will threaten to kill you, but you cannot even show Muhammad standing still without risking your life. That double standard, Parker and Stone argued, was the real problem. But here is the thing, that was all within the story. In the actual episode that aired on Comedy Central, the moment where Muhammad was supposed to appear on screen in the Family Guy clip was replaced with a black title card. The card read that Comedy Central had refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad. It was not part of the joke. It was not Parker and Stone being clever. It was the network genuinely stepping in and censoring the episode, right at the exact moment the episode was arguing against censorship. The irony was so thick you could barely breathe through it. Parker and Stone publicly criticized the decision. They pointed out the obvious contradiction. Here was an episode whose entire message was about standing up to censorship and intimidation, and the network was censoring it in real time. Comedy Central issued a statement defending themselves, saying that in light of recent world events, they felt they had made the right decision. Parker and Stone disagreed, but there was nothing they could do. The network owned the airwaves, and the network had made its choice. What is interesting is that despite all the controversy about Muhammad, a small detail slipped through the cracks. Even though Comedy Central censored Muhammad in the Family Guy scene within the episode, Muhammad was still visible in the South Park opening title sequence. He was right there in the crowd shot, the same place he had been since season 6, completely uncensored. Nobody at the network seemed to notice or think to remove him from the opening credits. It was an oversight, but a telling one. The character they were so afraid of showing was literally on screen at the beginning of every single episode, and nobody caught it. Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Cartoon Wars Part 2 are now 2 of the 5 South Park episodes that have been permanently banned from all streaming platforms. You cannot watch them on Paramount Plus. You cannot watch them on any legal streaming service. Like Super Best Friends, the only official way to see them is on the Season 10 DVD set. They were removed from the South Park Studios website, removed from Netflix, removed from Hulu, removed from HBO Max, and removed from every other platform that has ever carried the show. But Cartoon Wars was just the beginning. Parker and Stone lost that battle with their network, but they did not give up the war. They spent the next 4 years waiting, working, and planning. And when the show hit its 200th episode in April 2010, they decided to go back to the exact same fight, only this time they would push even harder than before. They would bring back every celebrity the show had ever mocked. They would bring back the Super Best Friends. They would bring back Muhammad, and they would dare their network and the world to try to stop them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What they did not expect was that this time, the consequences would go far beyond censored title cards and angry network executives. This time, real threats would be made against real people. The police would get involved, the FBI would get involved, and South Park would become the center of an international incident that had nothing to do with comedy and everything to do with whether or not a cartoon could get someone killed. Section 5, 200 and 201, the most dangerous episodes in television history. 4 years passed. 4 years between Cartoon Wars and what came next. And during those 4 years, Trey Parker and Matt Stone kept making South Park the way they always had. They went after new targets, found new controversies, and kept pushing the boundaries of what their network would allow. But they never forgot about Muhammad. They never forgot about the black title card that Comedy Central had slapped over their episode. They never forgot about being told, for the first time in their careers, that there was one subject they were absolutely not allowed to touch, and they never stopped wanting to go back. The opportunity came in April 2010 when South Park reached a genuine milestone. The show was about to air its 200th episode. 200 episodes of any television show is a major achievement. Most shows never get close to that number. And for Parker and Stone, the 200th episode was a chance to do something special, something that celebrated the show's history, something that brought back old storylines, old characters, old controversies, something that reminded the audience of everything South Park had been over the past 13 years, and something that brought back Muhammad. Episode 200 aired on Comedy Central on April 14th, 2010. The plot was deliberately designed to be the biggest, most ambitious, most self-referencing episode the show had ever attempted. The setup went like this. Tom Cruise, who South Park had mocked repeatedly over the years, gets recognized in the town of South Park and is humiliated once again. Furious, Cruise decides that he has had enough. He contacts every single celebrity that South Park has ever made fun of, and there are a lot of them. The episode brought back parody versions of Kanye West, Paris Hilton, Rob Reiner, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Mel Gibson, Barbra Streisand, and dozens of others. Together, all of these celebrities decide to file a massive lawsuit against the town of South Park for years of mockery and disrespect. But there is a catch. Tom Cruise says he will drop the lawsuit and make everything go away under one condition. He wants to meet the Prophet Muhammad, not because he cares about Islam or religion or the Danish cartoon controversy. He wants to meet Muhammad because, in the world of the show, Muhammad has developed a special power. A power that makes it impossible for anyone to ridicule or make fun of him. Cruise wants to figure out how this power works so that he can use it on himself. If Muhammad is immune to mockery, then Cruise wants that same immunity. It was a genius concept. Parker and Stone had taken the real-world situation, the fact that Comedy Central would not allow Muhammad to be mocked or even shown on television, and turned it into an actual superpower within the show. Muhammad could not be made fun of, not because of any magical ability, but because threatening violence works. The episode was making the same argument that Cartoon Wars had made 4 years earlier, just from a completely different angle. The episode was packed with callbacks and references to previous seasons. The Super Best Friends returned. Mika Streisand, a giant monster version of Barbra Streisand from an early season episode, was referenced. Cartman's hand puppet Mitch Connor came back. The Ginger Separatist movement, led by a character named Scott Tenorman, who Cartman had brutally wronged in one of the show's most famous episodes, appeared as a major threat. It was a celebration of everything South Park had ever been, wrapped around a story about the one thing South Park was not allowed to do. Throughout the entire episode, Muhammad's image was covered by a black, censored bar. Every time he appeared on screen, which was often, he was completely blocked out. This was done within the show itself, as part of the story. The characters could see Muhammad, but the audience could not. His name, however, was spoken freely throughout the episode. Nobody bleeped his name. Nobody censored any of the dialogue about him. The black bar was the only concession, and within the logic of the show, it was presented as part of the joke. The whole point was that Muhammad was this incredibly important character who nobody was allowed to actually see. Episode 200 aired, and the reaction was immediate. Not from the general public, who mostly found the episode funny and clever. Not from critics, who gave it positive reviews. The reaction came from a group called Revolution Muslim, a small but vocal organization based in New York City that described itself as advocating against Western imperialism and in favor of Islamic values. On their website, Revolution Muslim posted a message directed at Parker and Stone. The message included a photograph of Theo van Gogh, a Dutch filmmaker who had been shot and stabbed to death on the streets of Amsterdam in November 2004. Van Gogh had been murdered by an extremist who was enraged by a short film Van Gogh had made about the treatment of women in some Muslim communities. The film had been written by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a Muslim woman who rejected certain traditional Islamic practices. Van Gogh's murder was one of the most high-profile acts of religiously motivated violence in modern European history. And Revolution Muslim posted his photograph alongside their message to Parker and Stone. The message, written by a man who went by the name Abu Talha al-Amriki, whose real name was Zachary Chesser, stated that Parker and Stone needed to be warned about what they were doing. It said that they would probably end up like Theo Van Gogh for airing the show. Chesser later insisted to journalists that the post was not a threat, but a warning, a prediction of what would likely happen to them. When asked if Parker and Stone should feel threatened, he told the Associated Press that they should feel threatened by what they did. The post also included the addresses of both Comedy Central's New York office and Parker and Stone's production office in California. Whether it was a threat or a warning, the effect was the same. Real fear, real danger, real consequences. The response from law enforcement was immediate. The New York City Police Department increased security around Comedy Central's headquarters in direct response to the Revolution Muslim post. Officers were stationed at the building, security protocols were heightened. Law enforcement officials told reporters that while they believed Revolution Muslim itself was all talk and had never engaged in actual violence, they were concerned that the website post could inspire violence from others. The fear was not necessarily that the people who wrote the message would carry out an attack, but that someone else, someone unstable, someone looking for a cause, might see the message and decide to act on it. This was no longer about a cartoon. This was no longer about free speech debates or network censorship policies or cultural sensitivity. This was about people's lives. Real people who worked at Comedy Central, who showed up to their offices every day to do their jobs, were now potentially in danger because of an animated television show. Meanwhile, Parker and Stone still had to finish the story. Episode 200 ended on a cliffhanger. Multiple storylines were left unresolved. The celebrities were still demanding to meet Muhammad. The ginger separatist movement was still threatening the town. Cartman still did not know the true identity of his father. The concluding episode, 201, was already written, already animated, and scheduled to air 1 week later on April 21st, 2010. The question was whether Comedy Central would actually air it. They did air it, but not in the form that Parker and Stone intended. Between the airing of 200 and 201, Chesser escalated his rhetoric. On his Twitter page, he had posted a message before the controversy even began that said he wished death upon Parker and Stone and that they would burn in hell for insulting the prophets. This was not a vague statement. This was a direct personal expression of hatred aimed at two specific individuals. The pressure on Comedy Central was enormous. The network was caught between two impossible positions. On one side, they had two of their most valuable creators who wanted to air their show as written. On the other side, they had death threats, police involvement, and a genuine risk that someone could get hurt. The decision they made would define how America's entertainment industry responded to threats of violence, and it would set a precedent that would last for years. When 201 aired on April 21st, 2010, it was clear within the first few minutes that Comedy Central had made its choice. The network had gone through the episode with a heavy hand and censored it far beyond anything Parker and Stone had agreed to or expected. Every single mention of Muhammad's name was covered with an audio bleep. Not just in sensitive moments or controversial scenes. Every single time any character said the word Muhammad, the audio was replaced with a loud, disruptive bleep that made it impossible to understand what was being said. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what Comedy Central did to the ending. Parker and Stone had written a conclusion to the two-part story that was meant to be the entire point of the episode. Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus each delivered a speech about what the audience was supposed to take away from the story. These speeches were about standing up to intimidation. They were about refusing to let threats of violence control what people are allowed to say and think and create. They were about the idea that if you give in to fear, you are handing power to the people who threaten you. Comedy Central bleeped every single word, not a line here and there, not a few sensitive phrases. The entire ending, 3 consecutive speeches, lasting nearly 2 minutes combined, were reduced to nothing but a continuous, unbroken bleep. Anyone watching the episode as it aired heard Kyle start talking and then heard nothing but a high-pitched tone for the rest of the show. The moral of the story, the whole reason the episode existed, was completely erased. Parker and Stone were blindsided. They released a statement that same night, making it clear that the bleeps were not their idea. The censorship was not a joke. It was not a meta-commentary on the episode's themes. Comedy Central had unilaterally decided to alter their work without their consent, and the result was an episode that was, in the words of one reporter, practically incomprehensible. The fallout was massive. Comedians, journalists, politicians, and free speech advocates all weighed in, but the damage was done. The episode had aired, censored beyond recognition, and it would never air again. 201 was broadcast exactly once in the United States. It has never been rebroadcast. It has never been made available on any streaming platform. Along with 200, Super Best Friends, and both parts of Cartoon Wars, it was permanently removed from every legal avenue of distribution. As for Zachary Chesser, the man who wrote the Revolution Muslim Post that started the firestorm, he was later arrested and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Not specifically for the South Park threats, but for a series of offenses related to providing material support to a terrorist organization. The man whose words helped get 5 episodes of television permanently erased from the internet would spend the next 2.5 decades behind bars. But the censorship of 201 was not just about what was removed. It was about what was said in the parts that were removed and what those words meant in the context of everything that had happened. Because the speeches that Comedy Central bleeped, the speeches that nobody got to hear when the episode aired, contained a message so perfectly ironic, so brutally on point, that it almost seems like it was written by the universe itself, rather than by Trey Parker. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and that message, along with the public reaction to what Comedy Central did, would turn 200 and 201 into something much bigger than just banned television episodes. It would turn them into symbols of a much larger fight, one that the whole country was about to have an opinion on. Section 6, the censorship of 201. When Comedy Central blinked, to understand why the censorship of episode 201 matters so much, you need to know what was actually in the parts that got censored. Because the irony of what happened is so perfect, so impossibly well timed, that if you put it in a movie, nobody would believe it. Comedy Central took an episode that was entirely about how threats of violence are the only real way to silence people, and they silenced it because of threats of violence. The message of the episode and the fate of the episode became the exact same thing, and that is what turned 201 from just another banned episode into one of the most discussed moments in the history of American television. Let us go back to the ending that nobody got to hear. When 201 aired on April 21st, 2010, the final 2 minutes of the episode were supposed to contain 3 speeches. Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus each stepped forward to deliver their thoughts on what the audience should take away from the story. This is a classic South Park structure. At the end of many episodes, particularly in the earlier seasons, one of the characters would say something like, "I learned something today," and then deliver a short speech that summed up the episode's message. Sometimes these speeches were sincere. Sometimes they were sarcastic, but they were always the point of the episode. They were always the reason the episode existed. In 201, Kyle's speech was about the entire Muhammad controversy that had driven the plot of both 200 and 201. He talked about how throughout the whole ordeal, everyone had wanted to show things they were not allowed to show. He talked about how the reason they could not show those things was not because of any magical power, which was a reference to the fictional goo that gave Muhammad his immunity to ridicule in the story. The real reason, Kyle said, was much simpler. It was because threatening people with violence works. That was it. That was the lesson, not some complicated philosophical argument about religion or free speech or cultural sensitivity. Just a plain, brutal statement of fact. If you threaten to hurt people, they will do what you say. That is the only real power in the world. Jesus followed up by agreeing. He said that if you do not want to be made fun of anymore, all you need are guns and bombs to make people stop. Santa then added that the only thing you need to do is make people afraid and be willing to hurt them, and you can get whatever you want. The only true power, they all agreed, is violence. Now, whether you agree with that message or not, whether you think it is too simple or too cynical or too dark, you have to admit that it is an incredibly powerful statement for a cartoon to make. And it is a statement that was proven true by the very act of censoring it. The episode said that threatening violence is the only way to truly silence someone, and then it was silenced because of threats of violence. Parker and Stone could not have planned it better if they had tried, and they have said publicly that they did not plan it. The censorship was entirely Comedy Central's decision, made without Parker and Stone's approval, and it made the episode's point more effectively than the episode itself ever could have. Parker and Stone were furious. On the same night that 201 aired, the South Park Studios website posted a notice making it absolutely clear what had happened. The statement said that Comedy Central had added numerous additional censored elements to the episode that were not in the original version Parker and Stone delivered to the network. This was important because some people assumed the bleeps were part of the joke. Given South Park's history of meta humor and self-referential comedy, it was a reasonable assumption. Maybe the creators were deliberately bleeping the ending as a commentary on censorship, the same way they had used the censored bar over Muhammad's image as part of the story. But no, the statement made it clear, the bleeps were real. Comedy Central had taken their episode, gutted its conclusion, and aired a version of the show that the creators did not approve of and did not want the public to see. The reaction from the media and the public was swift and largely one-sided. Almost everyone who weighed in on the situation criticized Comedy Central for caving to the threats. The day after 201 aired, Jon Stewart dedicated a significant portion of his show, The Daily Show, which also aired on Comedy Central, to the situation. Stewart spent roughly 10 minutes talking about what had happened. He expressed his disgust at Revolution Muslim and their threats. He pointed out the absurdity and the hypocrisy of a group that enjoyed the freedoms of living in America while trying to use threats of violence to silence those same freedoms. Stewart was genuinely angry, not performing anger for laughs. He acknowledged that Comedy Central probably made the decision to protect their employees from real danger, and he understood that impulse. But he also made it clear that the result was deeply troubling. Bill Maher, the host of Real Time on HBO, also spoke out. Maher argued that the threats against 201 demonstrated exactly why free speech and civil liberties matter. He said that when a cartoon show gets threatened by extremists, it should serve as a reminder that Western culture and the culture that produces death threats over cartoons are fundamentally different things. But perhaps the most telling response came not from celebrities or commentators, but from ordinary Americans. A polling organization called Zogby International conducted a survey after 201 aired, asking Americans what they thought about Comedy Central's decision to censor the episode. The results were overwhelming. 71% of Americans disagreed with the network's decision to censor the episode. Only 19% agreed with it, and among those who disagreed, nearly half said they felt strongly about it. The American public, by a massive margin, felt that Comedy Central had made the wrong call. This created a strange situation. Here was a television network that had censored an episode specifically to protect itself and its employees from potential violence. From a human safety perspective, you could argue that was the responsible thing to do. Nobody wants to see people get hurt over a cartoon, but from a free speech perspective, the censorship was a disaster. Multiple commentators pointed out that by responding to Revolution Muslim's threats with censorship, Comedy Central had essentially given a small group of extremists a significant public victory. One writer at the Washington Post put it bluntly, saying that the terrorists had won. A columnist at the Toronto Sun pointed out that Revolution Muslim was a tiny group, maybe half a dozen members at most, and yet this handful of people had successfully gotten one of the biggest media companies in America to alter its content. The message that sent to the world was clear. Threats work, violence works. If you scream loud enough and scary enough, the American media will fold. Now, some people push back on that interpretation. They argued that Comedy Central was not caving to terrorism. They were making a practical decision to protect human lives. And that is a fair point. The network had employees. It had office buildings in New York and Los Angeles. It had real people who came to work every day and did not sign up to be targets of extremist violence. The executives who made the censorship decision were not cowards hiding behind a desk. They were people with a genuine responsibility for the safety of their staff. But Parker and Stone did not see it that way. To them, the practical argument was exactly the problem. Of course it was safer to censor the episode. Of course it was easier to bleep out the ending and avoid the risk. But safety and ease were not the point. The point was that every time a media company chose safety over principle, it taught the people making threats that their strategy worked. Every act of censorship motivated by fear of violence made the next threat more effective. It was a cycle, and the only way to break it was to refuse to give in. This disagreement between the people who saw censorship as responsible safety management and the people who saw it as dangerous cowardice played out across the media for weeks after 201 aired, and it raised a question that nobody had a good answer to. Where is the line? How much danger is too much danger to air a cartoon? Is there a point at which the message of a television episode is important enough to risk actual human lives? And if there is, who gets to decide where that point is? The creators of the show, the network executives, the audience, the government? Nobody resolved that question. Nobody has resolved it to this day. But the consequences of Comedy Central's decision were permanent and irreversible. Both 200 and 201 were pulled from circulation immediately after their initial airings. 201 in particular was never broadcast again in the United States. Neither episode was added to any streaming platform. When South Park moved to HBO Max, both episodes were excluded. When the show moved again to Paramount Plus, both were excluded again. They remain unavailable on every legal streaming service. The DVD release of season 14 does include both episodes, but even there, the censorship remains. The versions on the DVD are the same censored versions that aired on television. Muhammad's name is still bleeped, his image is still blocked, and the ending speeches are still completely covered by the audio bleep. There is no official, unaltered version of 201 available anywhere in the world through legal channels. Interestingly, despite all the controversy, both 200 and 201 were nominated for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program in 2010. The television industry itself recognized the episodes as some of the best animated work produced that year, even though most people could never see them in their intended form. And then there was the matter of Zachary Chesser, the man behind the Revolution Muslim Post that started it all. In the months following the South Park controversy, Chesser attempted to travel to Somalia to join the militant group Al-Shabaab. He was arrested at a New York airport before he could leave the country. He was charged with providing material support to a designated terrorist organization, communicating threats, and soliciting violence. In February 2011, Chesser was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The South Park threats were cited as part of the pattern of behavior that led to his conviction. The man who had written that Parker and Stone would probably end up like Theo Van Gogh would spend the next quarter century in a prison cell. Parker and Stone, for their part, survived the ordeal and kept making the show. But the events of April 2010 left a mark on South Park and on the broader entertainment industry. The 5 episodes that were banned, Super Best Friends, Cartoon Wars Part 1, Cartoon Wars Part 2, 200, and 201 remain the only episodes in the show's entire history that are permanently unavailable on streaming platforms. Every other episode, no matter how offensive, no matter how controversial, no matter how many groups it insulted, can be found on Paramount Plus. But those 5 are gone, possibly forever, and the thing that got them banned was not their content. It was not that they were too vulgar or too mean or too disrespectful. Plenty of South Park episodes are all of those things and more. What got them banned was that they touched the one subject that carried a real physical threat behind it. The censorship was not about taste, it was about terror, and that distinction is what makes these 5 episodes different from every other banned or controversial piece of television in history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the Muhammad controversy, as massive as it was not the only religious war South Park found itself fighting. Because a few years before Parker and Stone went to battle with Islamic extremism and their own network, they picked a fight with a very different kind of powerful religious organization. One that did not use threats of violence, but instead wielded something equally effective in Hollywood, which was money, influence, and the ability to make careers disappear. That organization was the Church of Scientology, and the fight South Park picked with them would cost the show one of its most beloved characters. Section 7, Trapped in the Closet, The Scientology Wars. The Muhammad episodes are the most famous banned South Park episodes, and for good reason. Death threats and police involvement tend to grab headlines. But before Parker and Stone ever went to war with extremists over depictions of the Prophet, they picked a fight with a completely different kind of powerful organization, one that did not threaten to blow up buildings or murder filmmakers. One that operated through a much quieter, much more sophisticated, and in some ways much more effective kind of power. That organization was the Church of Scientology. And the story of what happened when South Park went after Scientology is in many ways just as wild as the Muhammad saga, even if it played out behind closed doors rather than on the front pages of newspapers. It started in November 2005 with the 12th episode of South Park's 9th season. The episode was called Trapped in the Closet, and from the very first scene, it was clear that Parker and Stone were not going to be subtle about their target. The plot revolved around Stan Marsh, one of the show's 4 main characters who happens to score extremely high on a personality test administered by Scientology recruiters. Based on his test results, the Scientology leaders in the episode declare that Stan is the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the man who founded Scientology in the 1950s. Stan is confused and uncomfortable with this, but the church members are overjoyed. They believe their leader has returned. The episode did not stop there. It included a lengthy segment that explained in detail what Scientology actually teaches its most advanced members. This is the part about Xenu, an alien ruler who, according to Scientology's own texts, brought billions of beings to Earth millions of years ago and destroyed them with hydrogen bombs. Their souls, called Thetans, then attached themselves to living humans, causing spiritual harm and suffering. This is material that the Church of Scientology normally keeps secret. Members are only supposed to learn about Xenu after years of involvement in the church and after making significant financial contributions. The idea that a cartoon on basic cable was just laying it all out for anyone to see was, from the church's perspective, a serious problem. And then there was the Tom Cruise angle. The episode depicted Cruise, who is one of Scientology's most famous members, literally locking himself inside Stan's closet and refusing to come out. Other characters in the episode repeatedly asked him to come out of the closet, an obvious joke about long-standing rumors regarding Cruise's personal life. John Travolta, another famous Scientologist, eventually shows up and also goes into the closet. The jokes were not complicated. They were not hidden behind layers of satire. They were about as direct as South Park gets. Parker and Stone knew the episode was going to cause problems, so they took a precaution that tells you everything about how seriously they took the potential legal threats. The closing credits of the episode did not list the real names of anyone who worked on it. Instead, every single person in the credits, every writer, every producer, every animator, every voice actor was listed as either John Smith or Jane Smith. It was a direct joke about Scientology's reputation for filing lawsuits and the church's willingness to use legal action to silence its critics. By listing everyone as John and Jane Smith, Parker and Stone were making a statement. We know you are going to try to come after us. Good luck figuring out who to sue. The episode aired and immediately became one of the most talked about episodes in the show's history. The ratings were enormous. South Park fans loved it, critics praised it, but behind the scenes, things were already getting complicated. And the first sign of trouble came from a place nobody expected. Isaac Hayes had been the voice of the character Chef on South Park since the very first episode in 1997. Chef was one of the show's most beloved characters, the smooth-talking, soul-singing school cafeteria worker who the boys went to for advice about life, relationships, and everything else. Hayes was perfect in the role. His deep, distinctive voice gave Chef a warmth and coolness that made him a fan favorite. For nearly a decade, Hayes had been a core part of the South Park family. Hayes was also a Scientologist, and this is where things fell apart. In March 2006, roughly 4 months after Trapped in the Closet aired, a press release was issued in Hayes' name announcing that he was leaving South Park. The statement cited the show's religious intolerance as the reason for his departure. It said there was a place in the world for satire, but that South Park had crossed the line into bigotry against religious beliefs. Matt Stone's response was immediate and pointed. He told the Associated Press that in 10 years and over 150 episodes, Hayes had never once raised a complaint about the show making fun of Christians, Muslims, Mormons, or Jews. Hayes had cashed his checks and shown up to work while the show mocked religion after religion after religion. But the moment the show targeted his religion, suddenly he had a problem with religious intolerance. Stone called it what it was. Hayes did not have a problem with the show making fun of religion. He had a problem with the show making fun of his religion. And asking for special treatment for your own beliefs while being perfectly fine with the mockery of everyone else's beliefs was, in Stone's view, the real intolerance. But here's where the story takes its strangest turn. In the years that followed, questions began to emerge about whether Hayes had actually made the decision to leave the show himself. In January 2006, just 2 months after Trapped in the Closet aired, Hayes suffered a stroke. The stroke left him significantly impaired. His ability to speak and make decisions for himself was seriously affected. And according to multiple reports, including from people close to Hayes, he was not in any condition to be making career decisions in March 2006 when the press release was issued. The truth came out years later, long after Hayes had passed away in August 2008 at the age of 65. In 2025, Hayes' son, Isaac Hayes III, posted a public statement finally setting the record straight about what had happened nearly 2 decades earlier. His statement was clear and direct. His father did not quit South Park. Scientology quit South Park for him. After the Trapped in the Closet episode aired and Hayes suffered his stroke, the people around him, his assistants, his handlers, the core group of Scientologists in his inner circle, made the decision on his behalf. They issued the press release. They ended his involvement with the show. Hayes himself, the man who had voiced Chef for nearly 10 years, who loved the character, who joked with fans who recognized his voice, never got to make that choice for himself. His health had taken that ability away from him, and the people who were supposed to be looking out for him used the opportunity to settle a score with the show that had gone after their church. This revelation reframed the entire controversy. For years, the story had been that Isaac Hayes was a hypocrite who was fine with the show mocking every religion except his own. Parker and Stone had said as much publicly, and the media had largely accepted that version of events. But the truth was sadder and more complicated than that. Hayes was a man whose health failed him at the worst possible time, and the organization he belonged to took advantage of that to make a decision he might never have made on his own. His son said that his father loved being the voice of Chef. He loved the character. He loved connecting with fans. The idea that he would walk away from all of that over a single episode did not match the man his family knew. But regardless of the real reason Hayes left, the immediate consequence was the same. Chef was gone. And Parker and Stone, believing at the time that Hayes had genuinely quit because Scientology's feelings were hurt, responded in the most Parker and Stone way possible. The first episode of Season 10, which aired on March 22, 2006, was called The Return of Chef. In the episode, Chef comes back to South Park after being away for a long time, but something is wrong with him. He has been brainwashed by a group called the Super Adventure Club, which was a clear stand-in for Scientology. Chef's dialogue in the episode was cobbled together from recordings of Hayes' voice from previous seasons, cut and rearranged to make Chef say things he had never actually said. The effect was deliberately awkward and unsettling, making it obvious that the character was not himself anymore. The episode ended with Chef being killed off in one of the most graphic and brutal death scenes the show had ever depicted. It was ugly, violent, and clearly meant to be a statement. This is what happens when outside forces interfere with our show. This is what happens when you take one of our characters away from us. We will not let that character be remembered fondly. We will burn it down rather than let someone else control it. Meanwhile, the Trapped in the Closet episode itself faced its own problems. It had been scheduled for a rebroadcast on Comedy Central in March 2006, but the rebroadcast was suddenly canceled without explanation. The network replaced it with an old episode from 1998 and refused to comment on why the change was made. Immediately, speculation began about what had happened. Multiple media outlets reported that Tom Cruise had allegedly pressured Viacom, Comedy Central's parent company, to pull the rebroadcast. Viacom also owned Paramount Pictures, and at the time, Paramount was about to release Mission Impossible 3, which starred Cruise. The theory was that Cruise threatened to stop promoting the film unless Viacom pulled the South Park episode. Comedy Central denied this. Cruise's representatives denied this. Cruise himself said he would not dignify the rumors by addressing them directly. But the timing was suspicious enough that the Los Angeles Times coined the term "Closetgate" to describe the whole affair. Parker and Stone responded to the pulled episode with a public statement dripping with sarcasm. They addressed it directly to Scientology, saying that the church may have won this battle, but that the million-year war for Earth had just begun. They signed the statement as servants of the Dark Lord Xenu, throwing in references to Scientology's own secret mythology just to twist the knife a little further. The statement did not mention Cruise by name, but it did not need to. Everyone knew what it was about. Eventually, Trapped in the Closet did return to the air. The controversy actually boosted its ratings and its profile. Today, the episode is available on Paramount Plus and has not been permanently banned the way the Muhammad episodes were, but the scars of the Scientology fight remained. The show lost Isaac Hayes. It lost Chef. And it gained an enemy in one of the most powerful and well-funded religious organizations in the world, an organization with a documented history of going after its critics through legal action, private investigation, and intimidation campaigns. But what makes the Scientology story so interesting in the context of this video is how different it is from the Muhammad story. The Muhammad episodes were banned because of threats of physical violence. The Scientology episode was temporarily suppressed through corporate leverage and behind-the-scenes pressure. Different tactics, different methods, different kinds of power, but the goal was the same in both cases. Silence the people who are making fun of us. Make the content disappear. Punish the creators for daring to say what they said. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and South Park was not done collecting enemies, because right around the same time they were fighting Scientology and dealing with the fallout from cartoon wars, they managed to infuriate yet another massive religious institution, not Islam, not Scientology. This time it was one of the oldest and most powerful religious organizations on the planet, the Roman Catholic Church. And the weapon the Catholic Church used was not death threats or corporate pressure, but something almost as effective in the world of broadcast television, which was organized, relentless public outrage. Section 8, Bloody Mary and the Catholic League, a different kind of ban. By late 2005, South Park was already knee-deep in the Scientology controversy. Trapped in the Closet had aired in November, and the fallout was just beginning to unfold behind the scenes. Isaac Hayes had not yet quit or been forced to quit, but the tension was building. Tom Cruise had not yet allegedly made phone calls to Viacom executives, but the rumors were starting. It was already shaping up to be one of the most turbulent periods in the show's history. And right in the middle of all of it, Parker and Stone decided to air an episode that would open up an entirely new front in their never-ending war with organized religion. The episode was called Bloody Mary. It was the 14th and final episode of Season 9, and it aired on December 7th, 2005. That date turned out to be significant in a way that Parker and Stone may or may not have anticipated. December 7th is the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, one of the most important holy days in the Catholic calendar. It is a day specifically dedicated to the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, and one of the most sacred figures in the Catholic faith. Airing an episode called Bloody Mary on that particular date was, at best, spectacularly bad timing. At worst, it was a deliberate provocation. Knowing Parker and Stone, it was probably somewhere in between. The plot of the episode centered on Randy Marsh, Stan's father, who gets pulled over for drunk driving and is ordered by a court to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. At the meetings, Randy is told that alcoholism is a disease, that he is powerless over it, and that only a higher power can cure him. Randy, being Randy, takes this completely the wrong way. Instead of using the program to develop self-discipline and take responsibility for his drinking, he decides that since alcoholism is a disease he has no control over, he might as well keep drinking. It is not his fault after all. It is the disease's fault. Things escalate when rumors start spreading around town about a statue of the Virgin Mary that has started bleeding. People flock to the statue, believing it has miraculous healing powers. Randy joins the crowd, convinced that the statue can cure his alcoholism. He stands in front of it and gets sprayed with what he believes is miracle blood. He declares himself cured. Everything seems resolved. But then the Pope gets involved. In the episode, Pope Benedict XVI travels to South Park to investigate the statue personally. After a close inspection, the Pope determines that the statue is not bleeding from its backside, as everyone had originally believed, but from somewhere else entirely. The Pope declares that since the bleeding is coming from a place associated with normal female biology, it is not a miracle at all. It is just what women's bodies naturally do. Therefore, it has no divine healing power. Randy is forced to accept that he was never miraculously cured, and that if he wants to stop drinking, he is going to have to actually take responsibility for his own behavior. Now, Parker and Stone have said in interviews that the idea for the bleeding statue came from one of their own producers, Ann Garofino, who is Catholic. The concept was inspired by real-world reports of weeping statues, a phenomenon where religious statues appear to produce tears or blood through supposedly supernatural means. These events are well documented, have occurred many times throughout history going back decades, and are almost universally debunked by scientists as the result of condensation, natural materials, or outright hoaxes. Parker and Stone wanted to satirize the gullibility of people who believe in these kinds of miracles, and they wanted to do it in the most outrageous way possible. The scene of the Pope closely inspecting the statue and getting sprayed in the face was, according to Parker, Garofino's idea. She apparently thought it was hilarious. The Catholic Church did not think it was hilarious. The response from Catholic organizations was immediate, organized, and intense. The Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, led by its president William Donahue, issued a statement on December 8th, the day after the episode aired and the actual feast of the Immaculate Conception, condemning the episode in the strongest possible terms. The Catholic League demanded that Comedy Central apologize to Catholics everywhere. They demanded that the episode be permanently pulled from the network's rotation. They demanded that the episode never be released on DVD. And they demanded that Joseph Califano Jr., who was a member of Viacom's board of directors and a practicing Catholic, issue a personal statement condemning the episode. Califano did respond. He released a statement calling the episode an appalling and disgusting portrayal of the Virgin Mary, and he said he would have the episode reviewed by Viacom's president and CEO Tom Freston. Bishop William Skylstad, who at the time was the president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, also got involved. He sent a letter directly to Freston saying that Comedy Central had shown extreme insensitivity by airing the episode. The pressure campaign worked, at least partially, when Comedy Central ran a marathon of all the season 9 episodes on December 28th, 2005. Just 3 weeks after the episode first aired, Bloody Mary was not included. It was the only episode from the season that was left out. The network did not make a big public announcement about it. They did not issue a formal statement saying the episode was being pulled. They just quietly skipped it and hoped nobody would notice. People noticed. The Daily Show, which also airs on Comedy Central, actually addressed the situation in a segment. A correspondent joked about the fact that even a network as willing to be offensive as Comedy Central could be affected by religious pressure, while showing clips of all kinds of offensive South Park content that had aired without any problems. The implication was clear. The show could depict children being abducted by aliens, characters vomiting endlessly, and all manner of grotesque situations, and nobody at the network blinked. But a bleeding statue of the Virgin Mary was apparently where the line was. But Bloody Mary was not just an American controversy, it went international in a way that few South Park episodes ever have. And the responses from different countries reveal just how differently various cultures handle the same piece of controversial content. In Australia, Melbourne's Catholic Archbishop Dennis Hart wrote to the television network SBS, which was planning to air the episode, asking them not to broadcast it. The network's programming director initially rejected the request, but then reversed course and decided to postpone the episode, citing the broader controversy around the Danish Mohammed cartoons that was happening at the same time. The episode ended up being fully banned from Australian television for roughly a decade. It did not air in Australia until 2016, when it finally appeared on the channel SBS Viceland. In New Zealand, the situation played out very differently, and the result was almost the opposite of what the Catholic groups were hoping for. Leaders from the New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference, the Council of Christians and Muslims, and several other religious groups banded together to pressure the media company CanWest into canceling a planned airing of the episode on the music. Channel C4. They lobbied hard, they wrote letters, they organized, they made their case publicly and forcefully. CanWest refused. Not only did the network refuse to pull the episode, they actually moved the airing date forward to take advantage of the media attention the controversy was generating. Catholic groups then called for a boycott of C4 and its sister network TV3. At least one advertiser pulled their ads. A Catholic organization called Family Life International set up a website dedicated to boycotting CanWest advertisers. Even the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, weighed in, saying the episode sounded revolting, but that the network was free to air it. In a final twist, a completely unrelated company called C4 Productions, which had no connection to the C4 music channel whatsoever, actually applied for a court order to stop the episode from airing. They argued that people might confuse their business with the channel and that the controversy could damage their reputation. The judge ruled against them. The episode aired on C4 in New Zealand on February 22nd, 2006, and the ratings were extraordinary. The broadcast drew 210,000 viewers, which was 6 times the number of people who normally watch South Park on that channel. The controversy had done exactly what controversies often do. It had made people more curious, not less. The Catholic groups who had fought so hard to keep people from seeing the episode had, through their very efforts, guaranteed that more people would see it than ever would have otherwise. This phenomenon has a name. It is called the Streisand effect, named after Barbara Streisand, who once tried to suppress photographs of her home and ended up drawing far more attention to them than they ever would have received if she had just left them alone. And ironically, South Park itself had made fun of Streisand in multiple episodes, including the 200 and 201 storyline where a giant mechanical version of her attacked the town. The Streisand effect was practically a South Park concept brought to life. Now, here's what makes Bloody Mary interesting when compared to the Muhammad episodes. Bloody Mary was never permanently banned from streaming. You can watch it today on Paramount Plus. It is right there in the Season 9 catalog, available to anyone with a subscription. It was temporarily pulled from reruns in the United States, banned from television for a decade in Australia, and caused an international uproar involving archbishops, bishops, prime ministers, and court orders. But it was never permanently erased the way the 5 Muhammad episodes were, and the reason for that difference tells you everything about how censorship really works in the entertainment industry. The Catholic League used public pressure, organized boycotts, letters to corporate executives, and moral outrage to try to get the episode removed. These are all legitimate, legal democratic forms of protest, and they worked temporarily. But they did not create the kind of permanent existential fear that the Muhammad threats created. Nobody was afraid that a Catholic extremist was going to attack Comedy Central headquarters over a bleeding Virgin Mary statue. Nobody increased police security. Nobody feared for the physical safety of the network's employees. The Catholic response was loud and organized, but it was ultimately peaceful. And because it was peaceful, the episode survived. The Muhammad episodes, by contrast, were accompanied by the specter of real violence. Theo Van Goghi's murdered body was posted on Revolution Muslim's website. Addresses of Comedy Central offices and Parker & Stone's production company were published. The New York Police Department stationed officers outside the network's building. That is a fundamentally different level of threat, and it produced a fundamentally different result. Permanent erasure versus temporary suppression. The difference between a letter-writing campaign and a death threat. Parker & Stone have pointed this out themselves over the years, not to criticize Catholics specifically, but to highlight the double standard that they felt defined the censorship debate. They could show Jesus watching inappropriate content on a computer. They could depict the Virgin Mary in the most grotesque way imaginable. They could mock Christianity, Catholicism, Mormonism, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism in episode after episode after episode, and the worst that would happen was angry letters, pulled reruns, and temporary bans in a few countries. But the moment they tried to show Muhammad, even in a completely neutral and non-offensive way, suddenly people's lives were in danger and episodes had to be permanently erased from existence. That double standard, the idea that one religion gets special protection, not because it is more deserving of respect, but because its most extreme followers are more willing to commit violence, is the thread that runs through the entire history of South Park's censorship battles. It is the argument Parker & Stone kept making in episode after episode from Cartoon Wars through 200 and 201, and it is an argument that nobody, not Comedy Central, not the critics, not the public, has ever been able to fully resolve. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But religion was not the only force capable of getting South Park content erased. Because in 2019, more than a decade after the Muhammad controversy, Parker & Stone picked a fight with something even bigger than any church or religious group. They picked a fight with the government of the most populous nation on Earth. And unlike the Catholic League or Revolution Muslim, the Chinese government did not bother with letters, threats, or lawsuits. They just pressed a button and made South Park disappear from an entire country overnight. Section 9. Banned in China. Getting banned by a superpower. For most of South Park's history, the show's censorship battles had been fought against religious groups, extremist organizations, and its own network. The enemies were powerful, sure, but they were still operating within a system where free speech had legal protection, where courts could intervene, where public opinion mattered, and where the worst outcome was usually an episode getting pulled from, reruns, or erased from a streaming platform. The show itself survived. The creators kept working. The next episode always aired the following week, even when things got genuinely scary, like during the 200 and 201 death threats. The system held. South Park kept going. But in October 2019, Parker and Stone decided to pick a fight with a completely different kind of opponent. Not a religion, not an extremist group, not a corporate network. This time, they went after the government of the People's Republic of China, and the Chinese government responded in a way that no previous South Park enemy ever had. They did not write angry letters, they did not make threats, they did not file lawsuits or organize boycotts or pressure advertisers. They simply erased South Park from their entire country. Every clip, every episode, every discussion, every fan page, every trace of the show's existence within Chinese borders was deleted as if it had never existed. And they did it in a matter of hours. The episode that caused all of this was called Banned in China. It was the second episode of South Park's 23rd season, and it aired on Comedy Central in the United States on October 2nd. DV Tukstoshi Devin Pachmit. The episode was the 299th episode of the series overall, meaning it aired just 1 week before the show's landmark 300th episode. The timing was not accidental. Parker and Stone knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew exactly what the consequences would be. They did it anyway. The episode had two storylines running side by side. In the first, Stan, along with Jimmy, Kenny, and Butters, forms a death metal band called Crimson Dawn. The band gets popular enough to attract the attention of a music producer who wants to make a biographical film about them. This seems like great news at first. Stan is excited, the other boys are excited, but then things start to go wrong. The producer explains that in order for the film to be distributed in China, which is one of the largest movie markets in the world, certain changes will have to be made. Things that might offend the Chinese government need to be removed. References that Chinese censors might find objectionable need to be cut. The script needs to be sanitized so that it can pass through the strict content review process that all entertainment products must go through before they are allowed to be shown in China. At first, the changes seem small, but they keep coming. More and more of the band's actual story gets stripped away to satisfy the censors. At one point, Stan is literally sitting in his bedroom trying to write the script while a Chinese government official stands over his shoulder, watching every word he types and erasing anything that does not meet approval. Stan eventually realizes that the only kind of film the Chinese censors will accept is something completely bland, completely harmless, and completely dishonest. Something that has no edge, no personality, and no truth to it, and he refuses. He walks away from the deal, saying that no matter how badly he wants to leave his farm life behind, he cannot bring himself to compromise his work for China, and he adds that anyone who does make that compromise is worthless. The second storyline was even more provocative. Randy Marsh, Stan's father, travels to China to expand his marijuana business, Tegrity Farms, into the Chinese market. Randy does not understand or care about Chinese laws. He does not realize that what he is doing is illegal in China. He gets caught almost immediately and is thrown into a labor camp. And this is where the episode stopped being just a funny cartoon and started being a genuine political statement. In the labor camp, Randy meets two fellow prisoners. They are Winnie the Pooh and Piglet, not random characters who look like Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. The actual Winnie the Pooh and Piglet from the Disney franchise locked up in a Chinese prison. The reason they are there is based on a real-world event that had made international news. In 2017, internet users in China had started comparing images of Chinese President Xi Jinping to Disney's Winnie the Pooh. The physical resemblance between the two was, depending on your perspective, either slight or uncanny, but the comparison went viral. The Chinese government's response was swift and absolute. Winnie the Pooh was effectively banned from Chinese social media. Images were scrubbed, memes were deleted, references were censored. The idea that anyone would compare the leader of the Chinese Communist Party to a cartoon bear in a red shirt was treated as a serious offense. South Park took this absurd real-world situation and turned it into a plot point. Pooh and Piglet are in prison because internet users said Pooh looked like the president. In the episode, Piglet actually says the quiet part out loud, explaining that some people compared Pooh to the Chinese president and now they are illegal in China. It was a joke, but it was also a factual description of something that actually happened. The episode also took direct aim at Disney, one of the biggest entertainment companies on the planet. Mickey Mouse appeared in the episode, making sure that all of his employees, including various Marvel and Disney characters, were playing along with the Chinese government's demands. The message was clear. Disney, and by extension the entire American entertainment industry, was willing to bend its content, alter its stories, and compromise its values in order to maintain access to the enormous Chinese market. Parker and Stone saw this as a fundamental betrayal of creative integrity, and they wanted everyone to know it. The episode aired on October 2nd. Within days, the Chinese government responded, and the response was total. According to multiple reports, including from The Hollywood Reporter and CNN, every single trace of South Park was systematically removed from the Chinese internet. The show had never been officially licensed for distribution in China, but over the years, a small but dedicated fan base had built up around pirated versions of the episodes. Chinese fans had created discussion forums, fan pages, and social media threads devoted to the show. All of it was deleted. A search for South Park on Weibo, which is China's version of Twitter, returned 0 results out of billions of past posts. Full seasons and clips that had been available on the streaming service Youku, which is owned by the massive Chinese company Alibaba, simply vanished. Discussion threads on the forum platform Tieba were replaced with a notice stating that the section was temporarily closed in accordance with relevant laws and regulations. It was not just a ban on one episode. It was the complete erasure of the show's entire existence from one of the largest internet ecosystems in the world. Over 1 billion people live in China. And after Banned in China aired, none of them could officially find a single reference to South Park anywhere on their internet. The show had been effectively unpersoned within the country, wiped from the digital record as if it had never been created. Parker and Stone's response was instantaneous, and it was perfect. On October 7th, 2019, the official South Park Twitter account posted a statement titled "Official Apology to China" from Trey Parker and Matt Stone. The statement read like a sincere apology for about 3 words before revealing itself as one of the most brilliantly sarcastic pieces of public communication in recent memory. They wrote that, like the NBA, they welcomed the Chinese censors into their homes and into their hearts. They said they too love money more than freedom and democracy. They said that she did not look like Winnie the Pooh at all. They invited everyone to tune into the show's 300th episode that coming Wednesday. They closed by wishing long life to the Great Communist Party of China and expressing hope that the autumn's sorghum harvest would be bountiful. Then they asked simply if they were good now with China. The NBA reference was not random, it was incredibly timely. Just days before the South Park statement, the general manager of the NBA's Houston Rockets, Daryl Morey, had posted a tweet expressing support for pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. The Chinese government's response had been furious. Chinese broadcasters pulled Rockets games from their schedules. Sponsors severed ties with the team. And the NBA, one of the most powerful sports organizations on earth, had frantically tried to distance itself from Morey's comments, issuing apologies and statements that many Americans felt were embarrassingly submissive to Chinese pressure. The NBA's willingness to grovel before the Chinese government in order to protect its financial interests in the Chinese market was exactly the kind of corporate cowardice that Banned in China had been satirizing. So when Parker and Stone wrote that they, like the NBA, loved money more than freedom and democracy, they were not just poking fun at China. They were poking fun at every American company and organization that had ever prioritized access to the Chinese market over its own stated values. And they were making it clear that South Park would not be joining that list. They had nothing to lose in China. The show had never been officially distributed there. There were no Chinese licensing deals to protect, no Chinese advertising revenue to preserve, no Chinese partnerships to maintain. Parker and Stone could say whatever they wanted about the Chinese government because the Chinese government had nothing to threaten them with except a ban, and they clearly did not care about being banned. The fake apology went viral. It was covered by virtually every major news outlet in the world: CNN, the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNBC, Al Jazeera, and dozens of other organizations all reported on it. The statement became one of the most shared and discussed pieces of content on social media that week. People who had never watched a single episode of South Park were suddenly talking about the show, sharing the apology, and praising Parker and Stone for having the courage to say what so many American companies and celebrities were too afraid to say. And that is what makes the China ban different from every other censorship battle in South Park history. When Comedy Central censored the Muhammad episodes, it was a painful compromise made out of genuine fear for people's safety. When the Catholic League pressured the network over Bloody Mary, it was an organized campaign by a powerful institution using its influence to suppress content it found offensive. But when China banned South Park, it was a superpower using its total control over information to make an entire television show disappear from the lives of over 1 billion people. No negotiation, no compromise, no court orders or public debates. Just erasure. Complete, total, and instant. The Chinese government never issued a formal statement about banning South Park. They did not need to. In China, content moderation does not require public justification. The government controls the internet infrastructure, the streaming platforms, the social media networks, and the search engines. If they want something gone, it is gone. There is no appeals process. There is no First Amendment. There is no independent judiciary to rule that the ban is unconstitutional. The decision is made, and the decision is final. As of today, South Park remains completely banned in mainland China. The show has never returned to Chinese streaming services, social media platforms, or fan communities. It is one of the most thorough and lasting bans the show has ever experienced, affecting more people than every other ban in South Park's history combined. And Parker and Stone have never apologized for it, not seriously anyway. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But China was not the only country that took issue with South Park, not by a long shot. Because while the Muhammad episodes, the Scientology battle, the Catholic controversy, and the China ban are the biggest and most famous censorship stories in the show's history, they are far from the only ones. South Park has been banned, censored, pulled, or altered in countries on virtually every continent. And when you line all of those bans up next to each other, the pattern they reveal is both fascinating and deeply revealing about what different cultures consider acceptable, unacceptable, and absolutely intolerable. Section 10, Banned Around the World, South Park's international rap sheet. Most people who follow South Park's censorship history know about the 5 permanently banned episodes and the China situation. Those are the big stories, the ones that make headlines and generate Wikipedia articles and YouTube videos, but the full picture of South Park's global censorship is much, much bigger than that. Because while the Muhammad episodes and the China ban get all the attention, the truth is that South Park has been banned, censored, pulled, or restricted in well over a dozen countries on nearly every continent. And each ban tells its own story about what that particular country considers so offensive, so dangerous, or so unacceptable that it cannot be allowed on television. Let us start with Kuwait, because Kuwait is one of the only countries in the world that has banned South Park entirely. Not one episode, not 5 episodes, the entire show, every season, every episode, every character gone. The reason is straightforward. South Park makes frequent jokes about Muslims and Islam, and in Kuwait, where Islam is the official state religion, that kind of content is simply not tolerated. There is no debate about it. There is no weighing of free speech against religious sensitivity. The show mocks Islam, so the show does not air. End of discussion. What is interesting about the Kuwait ban is what it led to. Rather than just leaving a gap in their programming schedule, Kuwait actually created a replacement. In the year 2000, an Arabic animated show called Block 13 was developed specifically to fill the void left by South Park's absence. Block 13 was designed to be a more culturally appropriate alternative, an animated comedy that could appeal to the same audience without crossing the lines that South Park constantly crosses. The show ran for a few years before eventually being canceled. It turns out that making a version of South Park that does not offend anyone is a lot harder than it sounds, mostly because the entire point of South Park is to offend everyone. Japan's history with South Park is more complicated because Japan did not ban the entire show. Instead, they banned specific episodes that hit too close to home for Japanese audiences and institutions. The most famous of these is Shin Pokemon, which aired during Season 3 in 1999. The episode was a parody of the massive Pokemon craze that was sweeping the world at the time. In the episode, a Japanese toy company releases a line of collectible creatures called Shin Pokemon, which quickly becomes an obsession for the children of South Park. But the toys have a hidden purpose. They are secretly brainwashing American children into launching an attack on Pearl Harbor, recreating the 1941 bombing that brought the United States into World War II. The episode included references to Emperor Hirohito, jokes about Japanese cultural stereotypes, and a recurring gag where Japanese characters try to distract American adults by flattering them in extremely personal ways. Nintendo of Japan, whose Pokemon franchise was the clear target of the parody, took issue with the episode. Right-wing groups in Japan also objected. The episode was banned from airing in the country, particularly because of its references to Pearl Harbor and the bombing, which remain deeply sensitive topics in Japanese culture and politics to this day. But Shin Pokemon was not the only South Park episode banned in Japan. Several other episodes were also restricted. The Do the Handicapped Go to Hell and probably two-parter from season 4 was banned because of its heavy focus on Christianity, which is not widely practiced in Japan, and whose depiction in the episode was considered too irreverent for Japanese audiences. A Ladder to Heaven from season 6 was banned for similar reasons. Woodland Critter Christmas and 2 Days Before the Day After Tomorrow were also restricted, though the specific reasons for those bans have been less clearly documented. Romania has its own South Park story. The show was briefly banned from Romanian television starting around the year 2000 after the country's National Audiovisual Council decided that the season 3 episode Jubilee was anti-Semitic. The episode's plot involves Kyle attending a Jewish scout camp, and the depiction of Jewish customs and characters in the episode was considered offensive enough to prompt complaints from Romania's Jewish community. The ban did not last forever. South Park eventually returned to Romanian television, first on MTV Romania in 2008 and later on Comedy Central Romania in 2016. But the episode Quintuplets 2000, which involves a custody battle over Romanian quintuplets and includes various jokes about Romanian culture, remains banned on Romanian TV specifically while still being available to Romanian viewers online through the South Park Studios website. Italy has banned multiple South Park episodes over the years, and the reasons cover a wide range of sensitive topics. Cartman Joins Nambla from season 4 was banned due to its storyline involving Cartman unknowingly connecting with an organization of adults who prey on children. The episode also has a subplot where Kenny repeatedly tries to cause his mother to lose her unborn baby. The combination of those two storylines was too much for Italian broadcasters, who pulled the episode from their schedule. The Do the Handicapped Go to Hell and probably two-parter was also banned in Italy because of its deeply critical and irreverent take on the Catholic Church and organized religion in general. Given that Italy is home to the Vatican and has an overwhelmingly Catholic population, this was not a surprising decision. Christmas Snow from a much later season was also banned in Italy because of scenes depicting Santa Claus and Jesus Christ using cocaine together. What is notable about the Italian bans is that most of them were eventually lifted. Worldwide Recorder Concert had its ban lifted in April 2006. Cartman Joins Nambla was unbanned in May 2006. The Do the Handicapped Go to Hell ban was also lifted in May 2006 and probably followed the next day. Christmas Snow took much longer, with its ban not being lifted until January 2021. This pattern suggests that Italian broadcasters treated the bans as temporary measures rather than permanent ones, waiting for the initial controversy to die down before quietly putting the episodes back into rotation. India banned South Park entirely in 2010, though the circumstances were a bit unusual. The ban came shortly before the airing of the infamous episodes 200 and 201, and Indian news outlets reported that it was apparently a coincidence that the government decided to censor the show just before those episodes created a worldwide firestorm. The official reason given was general vulgarity concerns. Whether the timing was truly coincidental or whether Indian officials had gotten advance word about the Muhammad storyline and wanted to get ahead of any potential unrest is something that has never been definitively established. What we do know is that South Park was off the air in India for several years before eventually returning to the country through Netflix in 2019. Sri Lanka banned the entire series after the 200 and 201 controversy, but not because of the Muhammad content specifically. Sri Lanka is a majority Buddhist country, and in those episodes, Buddha was depicted snorting cocaine in front of children. The show was presenting Buddha alongside other religious figures as part of the Super Best Friends team, and while the other depictions caused their own controversies elsewhere, it was the cocaine-snorting Buddha that crossed the line for Sri Lankan authorities. The entire show was pulled from the country as a result. Russia's interactions with South Park's censorship have been more surgical. Rather than banning entire episodes or the whole show, Russian broadcasters have tended to simply cut out the specific scenes that they find objectionable. The most well-known example is from the season 13 episode Pinewood Derby, in which South Park depicts various world leaders reacting to an alien crisis. Russian President Vladimir Putin was shown in the episode in an unflattering way, portrayed as greedy and desperate along with the other world leaders. The Russian channel 2x2, which broadcasts the show, simply cut the scene depicting Putin and aired the rest of the episode normally. It was a targeted edit rather than a full ban, which is a very different approach from what countries like Kuwait or China did. Mexico also had a notable censorship incident with South Park, again involving Pinewood Derby. The episode depicted the then president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, in an unflattering light. When the episode was scheduled to air on MTV Latin America's Mexican feed, it was pulled from the broadcast. The network claimed that the reason was not censorship but rather a bureaucratic issue. They said they had failed to obtain the required authorization from the Mexican Secretariat of the Interior to display the Mexican flag on television in time for the scheduled airing. Mexican South Park fans were skeptical of this explanation and widely viewed the decision as political censorship. After the authorization was eventually granted, the episode aired in its entirety on April 4th, Divitoxtoshi Desmitai. Costa Rica banned a specific episode of South Park in 2011 after years of complaints. The episode in question was Rainforest Schmain Forest from Season 3, which aired back in 1999. In the episode, the boys visit Costa Rica as part of a school trip, and Cartman spends the entire time complaining about how terrible the country is. The depiction was deliberately exaggerated and offensive, presenting Costa Rica in an extremely negative light. Parker has said in interviews that the episode was largely a reflection of his own personal feelings about a bad experience in the country. Costa Rican officials and citizens did not appreciate having their nation portrayed that way on one of the most watched shows in the world, and the episode was eventually banned from airing in the country. The United Kingdom has generally been more permissive with South Park than many other countries, but there have been exceptions. The episode Proper Condom Use from Season 5, which dealt with sex education in an extremely graphic way involving children, was refused broadcast by the British channel Sky One. The episode was considered too explicit and too graphic for UK audiences, even by the standards of a show that is already rated for mature viewers. Australia similarly gave the episode a higher age rating and moved it to a later time slot. When you step back and look at all of these bans together, a clear pattern emerges. Every country has its own set of topics that it considers untouchable. In Kuwait, it is Islam. In Japan, it is Pearl Harbor and wartime history. In Romania, it is anti-Semitism. In Italy, it is the Catholic Church. In Sri Lanka, it is Buddhism. In China, it is the government itself. In Russia, it is the president. South Park, by going after absolutely everything and everyone with equal enthusiasm, has managed to find and step on the specific nerve of nearly every culture it has reached. The show treats every topic the same way, with the same level of irreverence and the same refusal to show deference to anyone, but different countries do not treat every topic the same way. What is a harmless joke in one culture is a criminal offense in another. What gets a shrug in the United States gets an episode pulled in Japan. What generates an angry letter in New Zealand generates a nationwide ban in Kuwait. And this is ultimately what makes South Park's global censorship history so fascinating. It is not just a story about one show getting in trouble, it is a map of the world's sensitivities, drawn in the shape of cartoon characters and crude jokes. Every ban tells you something about the country that imposed it. Every censorship decision reveals what that culture values most, what it protects most fiercely, and what it is most afraid of its people seeing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But despite all of these bans, despite being erased from China, restricted in Japan, pulled in Italy, and banned outright in Kuwait, South Park has not just survived, it has thrived. And the question of how a show that has made enemies of governments, churches, extremist groups, and some of the most powerful people on the planet manages to keep going season after season is a story that has everything to do with the one thing that matters more than controversy in the entertainment industry, which is money. Section 11, why South Park can't be killed by now? You might be wondering how any of this is possible. How does a television show survive nearly 30 years of continuous controversy? How does it keep going after death threats, police involvement, FBI investigations, international bans, corporate pressure campaigns, the loss of a beloved cast member, and being completely erased from the internet of a country with over 1 billion people? How does a show that has been banned in Kuwait, censored in Russia, pulled in Italy, restricted in Japan, and blacklisted in China continue to air new episodes every year as if nothing ever happened? The answer, like most answers in the entertainment industry, comes down to money, but not just money. It comes down to the specific relationship between controversy and profit that South Park has mastered better than almost any other show in the history of television. Because the dirty secret of the entertainment business, the thing that nobody at any network or studio likes to admit publicly, is that controversy sells. Outrage generates attention, bans create curiosity. And when millions of people are talking about whether or not a show should be allowed to exist, that show's ratings tend to go through the roof. South Park figured this out early. Not through some calculated business strategy, but through lived experience. Every single time the show got into trouble, every time a religious group called for a boycott, every time a government banned an episode, every time a celebrity threatened legal action, the same thing happened. More people watched. The controversy did not drive audiences away, it drove them toward the show. People who had never watched South Park before would tune in specifically because they had heard it was causing problems. They wanted to see what all the fuss was about. They wanted to judge for themselves whether the show had really gone too far. The New Zealand airing of Bloody Mary is the perfect example of this. When Catholic groups in New Zealand lobbied hard to prevent the episode from being broadcast, when they organized boycotts and pressured advertisers and got the Prime Minister to weigh in, the result was not that fewer people watched the episode. The result was that the broadcast drew 6 times the audience that South Park normally got on that channel. 210,000 viewers tuned in, compared to the roughly 35,000 who would typically watch. The Catholic League's campaign to suppress the episode had functioned as the most effective advertising campaign the show had ever received in New Zealand. Every news segment, every newspaper article, every public statement calling for the episode to be pulled was essentially a free advertisement telling people that something shocking and controversial was about to be on television, and that powerful, people did not want them to see it. This pattern repeated itself over and over again throughout the show's history. The Scientology controversy around Trapped in the Closet turned that episode into one of the most discussed and most watched episodes of the entire series. The Cartoon Wars censorship generated massive media coverage that brought new eyes to the show. The 200 and 201 death threats turned those episodes into legendary, almost mythical pieces of television that fans have spent over a decade trying to track down and watch. The China ban made South Park front page news around the world and introduced the show to millions of people who had never given it a second thought before. This is not unique to South Park, of course. The relationship between controversy and attention is well documented across all forms of media, but South Park is unusual in how consistently and how effectively it has benefited from this dynamic. Most shows that generate controversy do so accidentally, and the controversy hurts them. Advertisers pull out, networks get cold feet, audiences are alienated. But South Park generates controversy on purpose, and it has built an audience that not only expects the controversy, but actively looks forward to it. The show's fans do not watch despite the outrage. They watch because of it. The outrage is part of the experience. It is part of what makes South Park feel dangerous and alive in a television landscape that mostly plays things safe. And the networks have always understood this. Comedy Central, whatever its faults in the censorship department, has always recognized that South Park is one of its most valuable properties. The show has been one of the highest rated programs on the network for virtually its entire run. It has brought in massive advertising revenue. It has defined Comedy Central's brand in a way that no other show on the network has come close to matching. Without South Park, Comedy Central would be a fundamentally different and significantly less profitable network. That commercial reality has given Parker and Stone an enormous amount of leverage in their relationship with the network. Leverage that very few other television creators have ever enjoyed. Think about it from the network's perspective. South Park causes problems, it generates complaints, it creates headaches for the legal department and the standards and practices team. It sometimes puts the network in genuinely difficult and even dangerous situations, as the 200 and 201 incidents proved. But it also makes the network a lot of money, and in television, money wins almost every argument. As long as South Park is profitable, as long as it is bringing in viewers and generating revenue, the network has a powerful financial incentive to keep it on the air no matter how many groups it offends. This financial reality is why Parker and Stone have been able to get away with things that would have gotten any other show canceled 10 times over. They know they are valuable. The network knows they are valuable. And that mutual understanding has created a working relationship where the creators have almost total creative freedom, with the very rare exception of situations where the network genuinely fears for the physical safety of its employees. Comedy Central will tolerate angry Catholics, upset Scientologists, offended politicians, and outraged parents. What it will not tolerate, as the Muhammad episodes proved, is the possibility that someone might actually get killed. But the financial protection goes beyond just the Comedy Central relationship. South Park has also proven itself to be valuable across multiple platforms and multiple revenue streams. The show has a massive presence in home video sales. The DVD and Blu-ray sets have sold millions of copies over the years. The show's merchandise, from t-shirts to video games, generates significant income. The South Park video games, particularly The Stick of Truth and The Fractured But Whole, were major commercial successes, and when the streaming wars heated up, South Park became one of the most sought-after properties in the industry. The show's streaming journey tells its own story about how valuable it is. South Park was originally available on the show's own website, South Park Studios, where fans could watch episodes for free. It then moved to various streaming platforms, including Netflix, Hulu, and eventually HBO Max. When the deal with HBO Max expired, South Park signed with Paramount Plus in a deal that was reportedly worth a staggering amount of money. The deal included not just the existing episodes, but also new seasons and several South Park movies and specials. The fact that a streaming platform was willing to invest that heavily in a show that comes with guaranteed controversy, guaranteed complaints, and 5 permanently banned episodes tells you everything about how the entertainment industry values South Park. The show has also been critically successful in ways that would have seemed impossible when it first aired. South Park has won multiple Primetime Emmy Awards over the years. It won a Peabody Award, which is one of the most prestigious honors in electronic media, given to programs that demonstrate excellence and distinguished service. A show that features children being abducted by aliens, characters eating their own parents in Chile, and a hand puppet named Mitch Connor has won a Peabody Award. That is either a testament to the show's hidden depth and intelligence, or a sign that the entertainment industry has a very strange sense of humor, probably both. But beyond the money and the awards, there is something else that has kept South Park alive through nearly 3 decades of controversy, and that is the show's willingness to adapt and evolve while never compromising on its core identity. South Park in 2025 is a very different show than South Park in 1997. The animation is better, the storytelling is more complex, the political and social commentary is more sophisticated. The show has gone through multiple phases, from the crude shock humor of the early seasons to the more serialized, narrative-driven approach of recent years. It has tackled topics that did not even exist when the show started, from social media, to streaming culture, to cryptocurrency, to artificial intelligence. But through all of those changes, one thing has remained constant: the show's fundamental refusal to treat any topic, any person, any institution, or any belief system as off limits. Parker and Stone still operate under the same principle they established in the very first episode. Either everything is fair game, or nothing is. They will make fun of the left and the right. They will mock the powerful and the powerless. They will go after your favorite celebrity, your favorite politician, your favorite religion, and your favorite cause with the same cheerful, ruthless disregard for your feelings that they have shown since 1997. And the audience respects that consistency. In a media environment where most creators carefully calculate which groups they can safely mock and which groups they need to avoid, South Park's equal opportunity approach feels refreshing to a lot of people. You might not agree with every joke. You might find some episodes genuinely offensive, but you know that the show is not playing favorites. You know that if it is willing to mock your enemy, it is also willing to mock you. And there is something honest about that, something that audiences have responded to for nearly 3 decades. Parker and Stone themselves have shown no signs of slowing down. They continue to create new seasons and specials. They have talked publicly about their plans for the future, including a live-action South Park movie that is currently in development. Matt Stone has said in interviews that they do not have an end in sight for the show, describing it as an awesome sandbox that they are still excited to play in after all these years. The controversies of the past, the death threats, the bans, the lost characters, the censored episodes, none of it has diminished their enthusiasm for the work or their willingness to keep pushing the boundaries of what a television show can say and do. In a weird way, the bans and controversies have become part of the show's identity, part of its legend, part of what makes South Park feel like more than just another animated comedy. The fact that 5 episodes are permanently banned, that the show is illegal in China, that the creators received death threats and kept going, that they lost Isaac Hayes and turned his departure into one of the most brutal episodes in the show's history. All of that has become woven into the mythology of South Park in a way that makes the show feel consequential, in a way that very few comedies ever achieve. Most comedies are entertainment. South Park is entertainment too, obviously, but it is also, whether intentionally or not, a test case. A living, breathing, 27-season-long experiment in what happens when a piece of art refuses to censor itself and what the world does in response. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and that experiment, with all of its ugly moments and all of its triumphant ones, with all of its bans and all of its awards, with all of its enemies and all of its fans, is ultimately what this entire video has been building toward. Because when you step back and look at the full picture, at every banned episode, every censored speech, every international incident, and every corporate surrender, a single clear lesson emerges. A lesson about power, about fear, about who gets to decide what the rest of us are allowed to see. And it is a lesson that, in one of the greatest ironies in television history, was delivered most perfectly by the one speech that nobody was ever allowed to hear. Section 12, the lesson of the banned episodes. What censorship actually reveals. We have covered a lot of ground in this video. We have talked about 5 permanently banned episodes, death threats from extremist groups, a war with Scientology that cost the show one of its most iconic characters, a battle with the Catholic Church that turned into an international incident, spanning multiple continents, and a single episode that got an entire television show erased from the internet of the most populous country on Earth. We have traveled from Colorado to Denmark to New York to China and back again. We have talked about religious leaders, network executives, law enforcement, government censors, and a man who is now serving 25 years in prison partly because of a cartoon. And through all of it, one question has been sitting underneath every story, every ban, every censored moment, and every pulled episode. That question is simple. Who gets to decide what the rest of us are allowed to see? Because that is really what this whole thing is about. It is not about South Park specifically. South Park is just the vehicle, the case study, the lens through which we can examine something much bigger. The show is crude, it is vulgar, it is deliberately offensive, it is not exactly high art by most people's definition. But the battles that South Park has fought over the past 3 decades are about something that goes far beyond whether or not a cartoon should be allowed to show a bleeding statue or a prophet in a bear suit. Those battles are about power. Specifically, they are about who has the power to silence other people and how they use that power to do it. And what the history of South Park's banned episodes reveals, more clearly than almost any other example in modern culture, is that censorship does not come from one place. It does not look the same every time. It does not always arrive through the same door, but no matter where it comes from and no matter what form it takes, it always has the same goal: make the thing that bothers you disappear, silence the voice that offends you. Ensure that nobody else gets to hear what you do not want them to hear. Let us go through the different forms of censorship that South Park has faced and look at what each one tells us. The Muhammad episodes were silenced through the threat of physical violence. Revolution Muslim posted a warning on their website that included the photograph of a murdered filmmaker and the addresses of Comedy Central's offices and Parker and Stone's production company. The New York Police Department stationed officers outside the network's headquarters. The creators of the show were told, in terms that were impossible to misinterpret, that continuing to depict Muhammad could result in their deaths. Comedy Central responded by censoring the episode beyond recognition, bleeping out the entire moral conclusion of the story, and then permanently removing all 5 Muhammad-related episodes from every streaming platform and broadcast schedule. Those episodes have never returned. The threat of violence achieved a total and permanent victory. The Scientology episode was suppressed through a different kind of power entirely. Nobody from the Church of Scientology threatened to hurt anyone. No extremist group posted death threats online. Instead, the suppression happened through corporate leverage and institutional influence. Tom Cruise was alleged to have used his relationship with Paramount, which was owned by the same parent company as Comedy Central, to pressure the network into pulling a scheduled rebroadcast of Trapped in the Closet. Whether or not that specific allegation is true has never been definitively confirmed. But what is confirmed is that the episode was pulled from the schedule without explanation, that the timing coincided with the promotion of a major cruise film, and that the fallout included the departure of Isaac Hayes from the show under circumstances that his own family later described as being orchestrated by Scientologists within his inner circle. This was not censorship through violence. This was censorship through money, influence, and the quiet machinery of corporate power. The Bloody Mary episode was targeted through organized religious lobbying. The Catholic League launched a coordinated campaign that included public statements, demands for apologies, letters to corporate executives, pressure on advertisers, and engagement with bishops and archbishops who used their institutional authority. To amplify the message, in the United States, the episode was quietly pulled from reruns. In Australia, it was banned from television for a decade after an archbishop personally petitioned the network. In New Zealand, Catholic groups organized boycotts, pressured advertisers, and even attempted legal action to prevent the episode from airing. This was censorship through institutional pressure, using the organizational power of a centuries-old religious institution to make a piece of content less accessible to the public. And the China ban represented yet another form of censorship entirely. When the Chinese government decided that South Park needed to disappear, it did not need to make threats or apply corporate pressure or organize lobbying campaigns. It simply used its total control over the country's internet infrastructure to delete every trace of the show from Chinese cyberspace. No discussion, no negotiation, no appeals process, no judicial review. Just a decision made by the state, executed instantly, affecting over 1 billion people. This was censorship through raw governmental power, the kind of power that does not need to justify itself because there is no one with the authority to demand justification. 4 different forms of censorship, 4 different methods, 4 different sources of power, and yet the result in every single case was the same. Content was suppressed, voices were silenced, things that the creators wanted the public to see were made harder or impossible to access. Now, here is where the real lesson comes in, because the most important thing about these 4 types of censorship is not that they all led to the same result, it is that the world responded to them in completely different ways. When the Catholic League pressured Comedy Central over Bloody Mary, the general reaction was mild. Some people agreed with the Catholic position, some people disagreed. There was a brief controversy, and then everyone moved on. The episode eventually came back into rotation and is available to stream today. When Scientology allegedly used corporate leverage to pull Trapped in the Closet, there was more outrage, but it was still relatively contained. The episode came back eventually. It is available on Paramount Plus right now. When China banned South Park from its entire internet, the reaction was largely one of amusement and admiration for Parker and Stone's sarcastic response. People shared the fake apology, laughed about it, and moved on. The ban affected over 1 billion people, but since most of those people were not part of the Western media conversation, the story faded from the news cycle within a few weeks. But when Revolution Muslim posted their threats and Comedy Central censored the Muhammad episodes, the reaction was enormous, sustained, and genuinely anguished. Jon Stewart devoted a significant portion of his show to it. Bill Maher spoke about it on national television. 71% of Americans said Comedy Central made the wrong call. Commentators across the political spectrum argued passionately about what the censorship meant for free speech in America. The story dominated the news cycle for weeks. Why the difference? Why did the threat of violence generate so much more outrage than the corporate pressure, the religious lobbying, or the governmental erasure? The answer, uncomfortable as it might be, is that the violence worked. It achieved something that the other forms of censorship could not: permanent, irreversible suppression. The Catholic League could not get Bloody Mary permanently banned. They tried, and they failed. The episode came back. Scientology could not get Trapped in the Closet permanently banned. The episode came back. Even China, with all of its power over its own internet, could only ban the show within its own borders. People outside of China can still watch every episode, but the 5 Muhammad episodes are gone. Not temporarily, not in some countries, but not others. Gone from every legal streaming platform on Earth. Gone from the South Park Studios website. Gone from Paramount Plus. Gone from every legal avenue of distribution except physical DVD copies that were manufactured before the ban took effect. The threat of violence achieved what no amount of corporate pressure, religious lobbying, or governmental authority could achieve anywhere else. It created a permanent hole in the catalog of one of the most successful television shows in history. And that brings us back to the speech that nobody got to hear. The ending of episode 201 that Comedy Central bleeped into oblivion. The speech where Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus were supposed to explain the moral of the story to the audience. The message of that speech was not complicated. It was not philosophical. It was not ambiguous. It was a plain, direct statement that the only real power in the world is the power to threaten people with violence. That threatening violence works. That if you want to stop someone from making fun of you, all you need are guns and bombs and the willingness to use them, and the entire machinery of Western media will bend to your will. Parker and Stone wrote those words as a commentary on what was happening to their show. They were frustrated and angry that their network was censoring them out of fear, and they wanted to call that out directly. They wanted to say on national television that the censorship of their show was proof that terrorism works, that the people making threats had won, that the most powerful country in the world, the country that prides itself on free speech more than any other value, would fold the moment someone threatened to get violent over a cartoon. And then Comedy Central proved them right by censoring the speech. The very words that said threatening violence is the only real power were silenced because of threats of violence. The message and the censorship of the message became the same event. The irony was perfect, it was devastating, and it was entirely unplanned. Parker and Stone have said publicly that they did not intend for the speech to be censored. They did not write it as a meta joke. They wrote it as a sincere statement of their frustration, and then real-world events turned it into something far more powerful than anything they could have created on purpose. That speech, those words that most people never got to hear when the episode aired, might be the single most important thing South Park has ever produced, not because the words themselves are particularly profound. The idea that violence is an effective tool of intimidation is not a revolutionary insight. Everyone knows that already. What makes it important is that the entertainment industry proved it true in real time, on national television in front of millions of people. The theory was tested and the results were conclusive. And that is the real legacy of South Park's banned episodes. Not the crude jokes, not the offensive content, not the cartoon characters or the celebrity parodies or the religious satire. The real legacy is the demonstration, played out over nearly 3 decades, that the limits of free speech are not determined by laws or principles or constitutional amendments. They are determined by power, by who has it, by how they choose to use it, and by whether or not the people with the microphone are willing to keep talking when someone tells them to shut up. Parker and Stone kept talking, they lost episodes, they lost a cast member. They lost access to an entire country. They were threatened with violence. They were pressured by corporations. They were denounced by religious leaders on multiple continents. And they kept talking. They kept making the show. They kept pushing the boundaries. They kept refusing to accept that any topic, any person, any institution, or any belief system should be protected from the same irreverent scrutiny that they apply to everything else. You do not have to agree with everything South Park has ever done to respect that consistency. You do not have to think every joke was funny or every episode was fair. But you do have to acknowledge that in a world where most creators carefully avoid saying anything that might upset the wrong people, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have spent nearly 30 years saying exactly the things that upset the most powerful people on the planet. And they are still here, still making episodes, still picking fights, still refusing to shut up. That is the story of South Park's banned episodes, not just a story about a cartoon that went too far. A story about what happens when free speech meets real power, and a story about 2 guys from Colorado who, when told that the only true power is violence, responded by making another episode. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to subscribe. I have another video essay coming soon that goes just as deep into another topic you are going to love. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.